sustainably funded system of international justice for the most serious international crimes. Mr. President, conflict also has a lasting effect on mental health. According to the Secretary General's report, more than 1 in 5 people living in conflict-affected areas were estimated to suffer from depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Trauma in particular is associated with the occurrence of sexual and gender-based violence, which continues to blight many conflicts. While women and girls are disproportionately affected, the path-breaking research by All Survivors Project highlights the devastating impact of sexual and gender-based violence against men and boys, an often overlooked issue, as well as the need to provide relevant assistance and support to all victims and survivors. Mr. President, climate change is costing lives, exacerbating vulnerabilities and inequalities, and a driver of conflict, as well as a matter of human security itself. It is therefore of utmost importance that humanitarian action is environmentally sustainable, limiting potential damage to the planet. As an expression of our appreciation of the work by the International Committee of the Red Cross in this regard, Liechtenstein has supported the ICRC Climate and Environment Transition Fund, which will enable its transition towards sustainable and climate-smart humanitarian action in conflict. We are hopeful that other relevant actors on the ground will follow suit. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Liechtenstein for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of New Zealand.
Thank you, President. Thank you to our briefers from OCHA, the International Committee of the Red Cross, International Rescue Committee, and Ms. Boketa of Women for Women International. This annual debate on the protection of civilians in armed conflict is one of the most important topics on the Council's thematic agenda. Unfortunately, we live in a world where conflicts continue to have a devastating toll on civilians. Our daily news feeds have stories of civilians targeted in conflict zones, from Afghanistan to Ethiopia, Ukraine to Syria. Civilian deaths, psychological trauma, sexual violence, and family separations are but some of the wounds that will take generations to heal. Today's debate takes place against the backdrop of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia's unprovoked and unjustified aggression has caused unbearable heartache and resulted in 12 million Ukrainians fleeing their homes. It has threatened the unthinkable, nuclear conflict. In conflict, civilians pay the highest price. As the Secretary-General's report notes, in 2021, the UN reported over 11,000 civilian deaths across 12 armed conflicts. Healthcare personnel, medical facilities, and civilian infrastructure were directly targeted in flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. As our briefers have noted, we continue to see attacks on healthcare workers, 219 deaths in 2021 alone, and a lack of respect for international humanitarian law. This is unacceptable. Even war has rules. Listening to our briefers, we took away 3 key areas where we need to redouble our efforts to reverse these terrible trends. Firstly, we need greater determination from this Council to discharge its responsibility to maintain international peace and security. Russia's abuse of its veto has led to inaction by the Council in the face of an act of aggression. You must avail yourselves with all possible tools to prevent conflict, defend fundamental international norms, and seek negotiated political solutions. Secondly, we need all member states to demand universal compliance from both state and non-state actors with international law. We need to support all efforts to strengthen that compliance, including the draft political declaration strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, which New Zealand encourages all states to support. and we must ensure those who are responsible for violations of international law and international humanitarian law face justice by deploying the accountability mechanisms we have at our disposal. The erosion of international rules must not be allowed to become our new normal. Council resolutions which were agreed to protect civilians must not become rhetorical commitments. Thirdly, the UN Security Council should prioritise protection of civilians in UN peacekeeping operation mandates. Member states should provide trained personnel and resources to support those mandates. Early warning of threats to civilians and mechanisms that provide for timely and effective responses must be a baseline requirement in peacekeeping missions. Improved integration with the UN's peace-building architecture would better protect civilians at all stages of conflict. During New Zealand's last term on the UN Security Council, we worked with 4 elected members to secure the unanimous adoption of Resolution 2286 in response to the horrific escalation in attacks against medical facilities and personnel in Syria, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, and beyond. It was an important reaffirmation of our collective commitment to uphold international law in the face of such atrocities. It was also a demonstration of the important role elected members of this Council play in advancing the protection of civilians in the work of this Council. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of New Zealand for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the United States for hosting today's debate and the briefers for their presentations. Estonia aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union. Mr. President, protection of civilians is an essential part of the Council's agenda. With an overwhelming majority of harm caused by conflicts borne by civilians, we cannot address the maintenance of international peace and security without a strong focus on their protection in every conflict. The Secretary General's report yet again reflects an enormous gap between the parties' obligations under international law and the reality in situations of conflict around the world. Estonia reiterates its call for compliance with international law, including international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We underline the existing international law also applies in cyberspace. With tens of thousands of civilians in need of assistance, we find the consistent and increasing attacks against those who strive to help them, humanitarian and healthcare workers, abhorrent. Hundreds of healthcare workers killed and facilities damaged in 2021, a number which will increase exponentially this year due to the attacks conducted systematically and ruthlessly by Russia in Ukraine. Scores of humanitarian workers killed, wounded, or kidnapped, 95% of them national staff, most notably in Ethiopia, Afghanistan, and Syria. The civilian toll continues to include dozens of killed and injured journalists, whose work adds to the information and awareness of the impact of conflict. We welcome the focus of today's debate on ways to ensure better humanitarian access. We note with concern the various emerging challenges outlined by the Secretary General, including restrictions on the activities of female humanitarian personnel who are essential in reaching those most vulnerable, the fragmentation of armed groups, Central African Republic. We also note the increasing risk borne by local humanitarian workers due to the increased risks associated with humanitarian operations. Denial of humanitarian access is a violation of international law. Increased and consistent Council scrutiny, enhanced data collection, monitoring and reporting, and ensuring accountability for violations are key tools to counter the obstacles to humanitarian access. Estonia underlines and continues to focus on the contribution of digital technologies to identifying and assessing humanitarian needs. However, we take note of the Secretary General's emphasis on the need to adapt strategies to address their malicious use undermining humanitarian action. Mr. President, the Russian aggression against Ukraine has been carried out with cynical indifference towards the protection of civilians. It has been characterized by violations of international law, amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity, targeted systematic violence against the most vulnerable, including women and children, and extensive shelling and sieges of living cities. It has led to millions being displaced, thousands deported, disappeared, tortured, or subjected to sexual violence. It has also been characterized by massive disinformation, also here at the Council, about the Russian actions towards the civilians in Ukraine and their inhuman intent, as well as cynical and surreal attempts by Russia to claim that its actions fit under international law. Estonia has continued to emphasize the importance of accountability for all violations of international law through national, regional, international, and hybrid mechanisms. This includes the investigation and full accountability for the Russian crimes in Ukraine. We commend the tireless efforts of the humanitarian organizations, in particular local organizations, as well as the United Nations and ICRC, in working to ensure humanitarian access and deliver assistance to the people in dire need. We underline the need for safe and unhindered humanitarian access throughout Ukraine. Mr. President, the Security Council needs to step up its action to protect civilians everywhere, including through showing political will and providing adequate protection capacity for its peacekeeping and political missions. Otherwise, it continues to fall short of the aims set for its role in the UN Charter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Austria.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for organizing this meeting as an open meeting and allowing us to participate. Thank you also to the briefers for their steering presentations and to the Secretary General for his latest report on the protection of civilians. Austria aligns itself with the statements delivered by the European Union, as well as with the declaration by Switzerland on behalf of the Group of Friends on protection of civilians. Colleagues, we say it over and over again. Civilians must not be targets of armed conflicts. And yet we see it over and over again. Civilians are targeted. Women, men, children, and civilian infrastructure. Not just by negligence, all too often fully deliberate and intentional. A case in point is Russia's illegal war in Ukraine, where shelling of civilians and civilian infrastructure occurs daily, in clear violation of international humanitarian law, but also in violation of the Security Council's resolution regarding the protection of civilians. We join those who say this needs to stop, in Ukraine, but also in all other parts of the world. One of the biggest causes of civilian harm is the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. In such cases, civilian casualties amount to almost 90%, with long-term effects on mental health, infrastructure, and supply chains. We say it again and again. Full compliance with international humanitarian law is essential. And to underline this, Austria has been a staunch supporter of the process to elaborate a strong political declaration on EWIPA. It's high time we adopt it. Mr. President, in the concept note for today's debate, you asked us what actions could be undertaken to strengthen the protection of civilians in a comprehensive manner. Well, in our eyes, the answer is not too complicated. First, we must all ensure and enable the full, continuous, and effective implementation of Security Council resolutions by all UN member states. Second, we need decisive and swift reaction by the Council if these resolutions or key norms of international relations, such as international humanitarian law, are violated, to immediately counter acts that violate international law. And third, we must ensure accountability for such violations. In this respect, Austria reiterates the importance of effective and context-specific training on IHL, as well as respective guidance on all levels of military operations, strategic, operational, and tactical, to ensure compliance with IHL. Security Council resolutions in past years covered a wide range of issues in the context of protecting civilians, focusing on persons with disabilities, protection of medical personnel, missing persons, or the protection of indispensable civilian infrastructure. Fully implementing these, including by ensuring swift, safe, and unimpeded access for humanitarian workers to areas of concern, would go a long way to improve the fate of civilians in conflicts around the world. As mentioned in the SG's report, the cycle between armed conflict and hunger persists. Food must never become a weapon of war, since it will always target civilians. The deliberate creation of food insecurity, just like deliberate climate insecurity, aggravates an armed conflict, turning it into a global threat. Finally, colleagues, we must also think about public perception. In questions of peace and security around the world, the public expect that the United Nations will act. When civilians are harmed in great numbers, wherever that may be, the Security Council cannot remain silent. The Council must speak up, stop the activities causing harm, and help bring perpetrators to justice. You owe that to the thousands of civilian casualties that we witness every year. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Austria for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovakia.
Mr. President, we highly appreciate organizing this open debate on the issue of the protection of civilians in armed conflict, which remains to be of grave concern. The Secretary General underlined in his 2021 report that armed conflicts continued to be characterized by high levels of civilian death, injury and psychological trauma, sexual violence, torture and disappearance, as well as damaged and destroyed homes, schools, hospitals and essential civilian infrastructure. Moreover, the already unfavorable general situation has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which we deem totally unacceptable. Slovakia seizes this opportunity to express its strong commitment to the international humanitarian law and its principles it is based on. The respect for the international humanitarian law is an irreplaceable tool of effective protection of civilians in armed conflicts. We must beef up our endeavor to avoid, minimize, and mitigate adverse impact emerging from military operations on the civilian population in order to protect them from violence. This approach must be based on fundamental understanding that the protection of civilians is an obligation of all parties to conflict, which have to distinguish between civilians and combatants and between civilian and military objects, and to ensure that attacks are proportional and necessary. Mr. President, Slovakia, together with other 113 states, endorsed the Safe School Declaration. The access to safe and quality education is the fundamental right of every person, and the right to education is crucial for personal development, prosperity, response to multiple needs, and offers protection and hope for a better future. We are appalled that attacks on education continued to rise in 2021 and strongly condemn the attacks against students, teachers, schools and universities. We likewise call on all member states to endorse and implement the declaration. Mr. President, last but not least, let me once again condemn unjustified and unprovoked aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine in blatant violation of international law. The impact of Russia's military aggression is felt by undernourished victims from Africa and the Middle East, and the ripple effect will only continue to deteriorate until Russia stops this senseless war. Low supplies and skyrocketing prices are directly impacted dozens of countries, many of which were already food insecure before the war started. And as we know, hunger is not only the consequence of the conflict, it is often its cause. We do already see the increased social tensions in middle and low-income countries, where civilians pay the highest price of food and energy shortages. The aggressor accountable for this situation is evident. Slovakia recently joined Canada and other 39 member states and the European Union in calling upon Russia to respect and comply with ICJ's order on preliminary measures of 16 March 2022 and suspend immediately its military operations in Ukraine, and we reiterate our strong call to do so without further delay. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovakia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Spain.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, President, and allow me to begin my statement by thanking you for convening today's meeting. Spain supports the statement of the European Union. 11,075 civilians died in 12 conflicts around the world in 2021. This is a 17% increase over the previous year, 2020, although unverified figures are much higher. We are witnessing a proliferation of conflicts, violence against civilians, and other forms of violence, and this has sharply raised the levels of vulnerability of millions of people in Nigeria, Ethiopia, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Mali, Burkina Faso, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Myanmar, among others, and now in Ukraine. Following the 2030 Agenda, the United Nations and this Council should apply the triple nexus of the initiatives adopted to prevent cycles of violence, reduce their impact and the scale of that violence, and limit the time frame of those cycles, as well as protect civilians. The illegal, unjustified aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, which Spain emphatically condemns, has once again shown the enormous vulnerability of the civilian population. It has also shown that disinformation and the infodemic are violating the rights of a civilian population, which faces both the violation of its rights and the denial that those rights are being violated. It is essential to demand respect for human rights, the rights of refugees, and international humanitarian law. When we see grave violations of these rights, we must strengthen the mechanisms to investigate and hold the perpetrators accountable. Spain is a firm defender of the fight against impunity. There cannot be a sustainable peace over time without justice and respect for human rights. Spain has supported the investigation by the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry of the Human Rights Council to investigate the rights violations during Russia's military attack on Ukraine. I wish to especially stress four priorities Spain has and the agenda for protection of civilians. The first is the protection of health in armed conflict. Yesterday, we attended the presentation of the report on violence against health in conflict 2021. This gave appalling data on attacks and destruction of health systems across the world. 3/4 of the health facilities in Tigray have been destroyed. Myanmar's public health system collapsed in the first quarter of 2021. Since February 2022, Russia has been attacking hospitals, ambulances, and healthcare workers. The World Health Organization confirmed 200 Russian attacks. All this is happening in a year when health is being endangered by the COVID-19 pandemic. Spain calls for all parties to conflict to comply with the Security Council Resolution 2286. Second, protecting education. We must work together to prevent attacks on schools and the military use of educational institutions. The Safe Schools Declaration and its guidelines, together with Security Council Resolution 2601, are essential to protect a sector of the civilian population which is vulnerable, girls and boys. Attacks on schools and universities have also had a significant gender impact. Female students and teachers continue facing higher risks of violation of their rights. Thirdly, the protection of the rights of girls and women, and especially the fight against sexual violence and gender violence. Spain has devoted a very high percentage of its humanitarian budget for Ukraine to gender programs in cooperation with the UNICEF, the UNFPA, and OCHA, as well as UN Women. Unfortunately, sexual violence as a tactic of war and a kind of torture and repression continues to be used today. There are no verifiable figures of these violations because of the stigma related to the aggression itself. A change in focus is therefore needed, because even when there are no reports, there are still sexual attacks and rape. Lastly, humanitarian access and the protection of healthcare workers. Spain defends humanitarian action based on principles and calls on all parties to armed conflict to respect humanitarian access, which is safe, fast, and unhampered. Healthcare workers must not run risks when they protect and assist the vulnerable populations. I thank humanitarian workers for their tireless labor to bring humanity back to where there is devastation. We have a legal framework to protect rights, as well as a common agenda to protect, and the 2030 agenda. The true challenge is in implementation. The courts on the national and international level must be a real instrument to prevent and to bring to justice those responsible for attacks on the civilian population. Spain calls on the Security Council to use the tools it has at hand, such as referral of reports on war crimes and against humanity to the International Criminal Court. Thank you very much, sir.
Representative of Spain for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Australia.
Well, good afternoon, Mr. President, colleagues. Australia welcomes this 2022 Protection of Civilians annual debate, and thanks to the Secretary-General for his report. It's clear that despite an existing legal framework supporting the protection of civilians in armed conflict, respect for international law continues to be flouted. Every day we are confronted with fresh examples of egregious violations of the international legal rules protecting civilian populations. As we've seen with Russia's illegal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and its wanton disregard for the protection of Ukrainian civilians, conflict is ruinous to societies and it generates irrevocable trauma. Civilians are adversely impacted by conflict on a daily basis in many parts of the world. Ukraine, Syria, Ethiopia, Yemen, South Sudan, and many, many more. And beyond the terrible, terrible harm inflicted upon civilians caught up in conflict, these situations also grievously undermine fundamental human rights. We unequivocally support measures to promote full compliance with international humanitarian law, especially in relation to the protection of civilians. And we must hold to account those responsible for violations of international humanitarian law and war crimes to ensure justice and to deter future perpetrators. National prosecutions and those by the International Criminal Court, where complementary to national jurisdictions, play a critical role. Today's report highlights the disturbing trend of obstructing free passage and timely delivery of humanitarian assistance to persons in need, as well as deliberate attacks against humanitarian workers. In northern Ethiopia, delays in delivering humanitarian assistance and attacks on humanitarian workers have contributed to a growing humanitarian crisis, with 9.4 million people now in need of assistance, and those numbers really shouldn't just roll off the tongue. Similarly, in South Sudan, attacks on humanitarian workers have prevented life-saving assistance from reaching people in need. Women and girls are disproportionately affected by conflict and violence. Protecting the human rights of women and girls in humanitarian crises is essential. That includes accountability of perpetrators of any form of violence, the appointment of gender advisors, the appointment of women protection advisors, and women's participation and leadership in all stages and at all levels of conflict resolution and peace processes. Another serious element of the challenges we face is to better understand how misinformation, disinformation and hate speech are used to inflame armed conflict, and how they heighten the risk of violence towards civilians and humanitarian staff. Australia welcomes constructive thinking, it welcomes constructive ideas on how the multilateral system can better intercept and counter these insidious and destructive tools of conflict. Mr. President, peace operations play an important role in protecting civilians by creating more stable conditions for physical protection, intercommunal dialogue, the protection of human rights, as well as contributing to processes of accountability within judicial systems. The credibility and legitimacy of UN peace operations largely depend on the willingness and capability of peacekeepers to act when civilians are under threat. Peacekeepers must be empowered and supported by both the UN and troop-contributing countries to protect civilians. And this includes being equipped to understand and to identify the early warning signs of heightened risk to civilians of the commission of mass atrocity crimes. And Mr. President, ultimately, we as a global community must work to ensure human rights violations and abuses and violations of international humanitarian law are enforced, and that accountability measures assure justice and deter future perpetrators. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Australia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Vietnam.
Mr. President, at the outset, we wish to express our heartfelt condolences to the government and people of the United States and the families of the victims regarding the tragic event in Texas yesterday. We thank the United States for convening this open debate. Today's meeting, though being an annual one, takes on new urgency when global efforts on protection of civilians are facing unprecedented challenges. Conflicts and security threats are raging in larger scale from Europe to Africa. Civilians, including women and children, continue to account for the majority of casualties in armed conflicts. The COVID-19 pandemic is still raging across countries in conflict situations where healthcare services are minimal. On top of the perennial hardship in terms of humanitarian needs, the daily lives and assistance to tens of millions of people are threatened with serious food insecurity and disruptions in supply chains, as the Council discussed in details last week. This in turn compounds fragilities in economic recovery for many. Urgent situations now have to compete for the already scarce resources for humanitarian assistance. In the face of such unprecedented difficulties, important principles must be ensured. Stronger emphasis must be put on the compliance with the UN Charter, international law, and international humanitarian law by all parties. It is crucial to uphold the principles of humanitarian assistance and to support the sovereignty and primary responsibility of states in protecting their civilians. All parties to armed conflict must fully refrain from attacking civilians and critical civilian infrastructure. In times of scarcity and major hardship, it is also critical to galvanize integrated support and synergy from various actors, from regional organizations, non-governmental organizations to private sectors. In the short run, the international community must take immediate measures. Protection of civilians should be prioritized by conflict parties as well as international partners. Now is the time to sustain political will and scale up humanitarian aid to various conflict situations to match the increasing needs. Access to assistance must be maintained and should not be politicized so as to lessen the serious situation that the latest report of the Secretary General detailed. In longer terms, however, all the above-mentioned measures cannot replace the imperative to resolve disputes peacefully and prevent conflicts so as to fully avert the plight of innocent casualties. At the same time, it is equally important to support conflict-affected communities, not just in their short-term need, but also in building resilience and adapting to emerging challenges, including climate-related risks. Mr. President, in light of such challenging job, it is encouraging that the Security Council, as one of the primary UN bodies, continues to pay regular attention to the protection of civilians. Thematic discussion as well as country-specific formats of the Council have incorporated these issues as a key element. To better respond to the mounting challenges, the functions of the Security Council as the primary body for maintaining international peace and security should be fully discharged. The Council should actively promote efforts to prevent and resolve conflicts. Another way for better protection of civilians is to expand discussions and adopt measures to tackle specific and important aspects related to protection of civilians, such as critical infrastructures, mine actions, food and water security, and to facilitate life-saving activities of humanitarian agencies and protection of humanitarian workers. Messages of unity from the Council are equally important. Mr. President, Vietnam understands firsthand the consequences of wars and fully empathizes with the plight of civilians suffering from armed conflicts around the world. We placed a high priority on post-conflict reconstruction and tackling war consequences in order to promote socio-economic development of our people and protect them from risks such as explosives, remnants of war. Vietnam was pleased to facilitate the adoption of Resolution 2573 last year, based on which the latest report of the Secretary General has elaborated issues related to the protection of civilian infrastructure. We remain committed to joining efforts for the protection of civilians in the time to come. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Vietnam for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Qatar.
شكرا لكم السيد الرئيس نشكر.
Thank you, Mr. President. We would like to thank the United States for having convened this open debate. We also thank the briefers from ICRC, from Women for Women International, OCHA, and the International Rescue Committee. We thank them for their very detailed presentations. Mr. President, we're meeting today while many conflicts are underway and new conflicts are happening with disastrous effects on the civilian, as is stated in the Secretary General's report. The impact of conflicts is not only limited to those areas where violence is raging. There are other consequences related to displacement, refugees, and the harmful effects economically and the threat to food security, which is already impacted by the climate change and the pandemic. The most effective way of sparing the suffering to civilians is to prevent the conflicts in the first place and to resolve them peacefully and diplomatically. In the absence of such a resolution, parties to the conflict at least should follow the international humanitarian laws and international law and avoid harm to civilians and civilian structure. Everything has to be done to guarantee the civilians' life, guarantee their unimpeded access to emergency assistance. In order to do that, what needs to be facilitated is work by the healthcare and humanitarian workers and ensuring their safety and security. It is lamentable that hundreds of these workers are victims of unjustifiable violence. Other civilians are also targeted by violence and have to be protected during conflict also. 20 reporters were killed in 2021, according to UNESCO. They were killed in areas of conflict. The state of Qatar vehemently denounces the assassination, the killing by the Israeli occupying powers of Shirin Abu Akleh, who was an Al Jazeera correspondent, and the producer Ali Al-Samoudi, who was attacked and wounded. These people were wearing clear markings identifying them as members of the press. This heinous crime is a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and a serious undermining of the freedom of the press and the freedom of expression. An immediate and transparent, impartial investigation has to be ensured by the Security Council. In this regard, the Council has to make sure that there is accountability for this. The right to education during conflict also needs to be ensured. And we underscore the Resolution 74/274 on this, which was put forward by the State of Qatar, and insisted on the educational aspect of life during conflict. The State of Qatar is trying to alleviate the humanitarian in providing assistance. We are amongst the 10 highest contributors to humanitarian assistance according to OCHA, and have contributed to the Central Crisis Response Fund. We provided $18 million to that. We're also contributing to development assistance to the brotherly Palestinian people, and we prominently help UNRWA and provide emergency assistance to Afghanistan through direct assistance to Kabul and our work to rehabilitate the airport of Kabul to make sure that humanitarian assistance can arrive safely. By way of conclusion, we'd like to reiterate our commitment to humanitarian work on the basis of cooperation, integrity, and impartiality. We will work together with the international partners so as to provide assistance everywhere there is a need to help the affected populations. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Qatar for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Yemen.
شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. Please allow me to, first of all, thank you for having convened this important open debate about the critical need to protect civilians during conflict. It's up to the international community and Security Council to undertake effective measures so as to protect the civilians in the cities and in the refugee camps, as well as protect them from terrorist attacks conducted by the Houthi militia supported by Iran, and so as to protect civilian objects in Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Any and all such attack is a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and has a serious impact on civilian infrastructure and undermines international peace and security. Mr. President, despite the continued truce, United Nations truce in Yemen, and which aims at alleviating the suffering of Yemeni people, despite that, numerous violations have been committed by the Houthis in the city of Marib. There are more than 4 million people there and 2 million are displaced. Violations also are present in the Hodeida governorate, in Ali governorate, and other governorates where the civilians are being constantly targeted. The militia use drones, ballistic missiles, and other heavy weaponry, which resulted in tens of victims, hundreds of wounded, including women and children's schools, hospitals, and mosques have been targeted. Children are recruited, brainwashed, and terrorism and extremism are being inculcated into them. This is a flagrant violation of international law. Also, the inhabitants are taken as hostages and used as human shields in schools, which are also used to stockpile weapons. The militia are besieging entire cities and deprive the people of their freedom to move, or they deprive them of water and food, which they need to survive. Hunger, therefore, is used as a weapon of war. The protection of civilians in Taiz is absolutely key. That city is besieged by the Houthi for almost 7 years. This should become a humanitarian priority. Our government is discharging its various commitments under the terms of the Stockholm Agreement, but the Houthi militia continue their violent campaign where the civilians are attacked. This has been going on for 2 months now. We call on the lifting of the siege of this city and underscore the need for the international community to honor its responsibility and put an end to the siege of Taiz, opening humanitarian corridors and enabling the passage of basic goods without any preconditions. Humanitarian assistance needs to reach those who need it most. And the Houthi militias have to cease and stop attacking humanitarian teams and convoys. We also need to open investigations into the crimes I mentioned. Mr. President, mines are a serious threat for civilians in conflict areas in Yemen. We signed the Ottawa Treaty in 1997 and destroyed all of our stockpile of mines, in particular anti-personnel mines, whereas the Houthi militia continue manufacturing and using about 2 million mines and improvised explosive devices in those areas which is beyond the control of the Yemeni government. And this resulted in the death and wounds to hundreds of our civilians, amongst them children. This weapon impedes the movement of people and threatens the lives of millions of civilians, in particular the displaced, who find themselves trapped by Houthi attacks, and anti-personnel mines which had been planted in their houses, in their streets, in the fields, and everywhere in such a way that it threatens the lives of civilians, despite the efforts made by the Yemeni army so as to clear the contaminated areas. Despite that, they remain a very serious risk to the civilian population. Mr. President, the Iranian regime continues supplying weapons to the Houthi militias, in particular the ballistic missiles. And this constitutes a serious violation of Security Council violations, in particular violation 2216, in 2231. The international community has to act so as to protect civilians effectively. We need true accountability here to make sure that all of the parties who violate the provisions of the resolution, and we can thus put the end to the humanitarian crisis in Yemen and facilitate the peace operations by the United Nations and put an end to the crisis in my country and arrive at just and lasting peace on the basis of recognized international parameters.
Georgia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Let me express our appreciation to the U.S. presidency for organizing this important debate. Also, I would like to thank the briefers for their comprehensive and informative briefings. My delegation aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union, and in my national capacity, I would like to add the following. We remain deeply alarmed over the findings of the UN Secretary General's latest report that civilian population accounts for the vast majority of casualties in armed conflicts. Those unlawful attacks against civilians constitute clear violation of international humanitarian law and rules-based international order. Georgia actively supports and stresses the importance of various international initiatives aimed at protecting civilians in armed conflicts, including the political declaration on the protection of humanitarian and medical personnel in armed conflicts, and the Safe Schools Declaration. Excellencies, as a result of Russia's full-scale military aggression against my country in August of 2008, more than 400 civilians and military personnel were killed and more than 1,700 wounded. Thousands joined 500,000 of IDPs and refugees that were expelled during the previous waves of ethnic cleansing from the two integral regions of Georgia. 53 Georgian villages in and around the Tkhinvali region in 2008 were fully cleansed and destroyed. 35,000 houses belonging to ethnic Georgians were deliberately burned and ruined. Especially since 2008, security and humanitarian situation in the Russia-occupied Abkhazia and Tkhinvali regions of Georgia has been deteriorating on a daily basis, and the list of human rights violations has been aggravated. Ethnic discrimination, violations of right to life, torture and ill treatment, arbitrary detentions, kidnappings, restriction of the freedom of movement, infringement of rights to property. These are just part of an incomplete list of violations. Violations that people have to endure daily on the other side of the occupation line. Mr. President, unfortunately, the aggression and occupation policy that the hybrid methods of warfare which are well tested against my country, has been applied against Ukraine on a larger scale. Thousands of civilians are killed and injured. Over 500 schools and 52 hospitals have been shelled. Entire cities have been razed to the ground. Haunting images of massacres with large numbers of civilian deaths and casualties, as well as destruction of civilian infrastructure, show the true face of this brutal aggression. We call on Russia to comply with the provisional measures of the ICJ of 16 March, which binds Russia to immediately suspend the military operation commenced on 24th of February of 2022, and withdraw all its forces and armament from the entire territory of Ukraine. We call on ensuring safe, rapid, and unhindered access of to populations in need of assistance by medical and humanitarian personnel, as well as protection of all medical personnel and humanitarian workers exclusively engaged in their duties. Herewith, we reiterate Georgia's unwavering support to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, including Crimea and Donbas, as well as Ukraine's navigational right in its territorial waters. Excellencies, it is vital that civilians everywhere are safeguarded and those responsible for violations of international law and international humanitarian law are held to account. We stand in solidarity with all those affected by violence and remain committed to contributing to joint endeavor to ensure that justice is served. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Georgia for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of South Africa.
Mr. President, we thank the United States for convening this meeting. We welcome the report of the Secretary General, which informs our discussions today. Furthermore, we thank all the briefers for their presentations today. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to impact on new, ongoing, and protracted conflicts, exacerbating existing inequalities, vulnerabilities, and drawing further attention to protection concerns. We witness escalating humanitarian needs with increased displacement of persons, the disruption of global supply chains, food insecurity, and famine. Vaccines have allowed many parts of the world to bring the pandemic under control, but their distribution remains unequal. It is therefore crucial that urgent measures are taken to ensure that COVID-19 vaccines are also made available to those in conflict situations. Despite being protected under international humanitarian law, civilians, including the most vulnerable, children, women, refugees, the displaced and disabled persons, as well as humanitarian and medical personnel, continue to be the victims of direct, deliberate, systematic, and violent targeted attacks by armed forces. Similarly, access to humanitarian assistance is compromised with the continued destructions of hospitals, attacks on medical transport, and essential services. We continue to urge that objects indispensable to civilian populations must be protected at all costs, and that the recently adopted Resolution 2573 pertaining to attacks against civilian infrastructure should be implemented stringently to uphold international humanitarian law. Non-combatants, including journalists, must be protected in keeping with the principle of distinction and other protective measures of the Geneva Conventions. Mr. President, we remain concerned at the continued politicization of humanitarian corridors, which has detrimental effects on civilians in greatest need of assistance. Despite these challenges, however, humanitarian personnel continue to carry out their work with bravery, providing assistance to the most vulnerable communities. We wish to highlight several areas where the Security Council could assist to strengthen the protection of civilians. First, the Security Council and member states should continue to support non-violent and community-based protection mechanisms where possible, such as political mediation, early warning activities, and unarmed civilian protection. Effective protection of civilians begins with a safe and inclusive dialogue with conflict-affected communities, states, and other stakeholders at all levels. Additionally, grassroots peacemaking efforts, including the role of women and the youth in these initiatives, should be promoted. Second, the Security Council and member states must fulfill their commitment to the full protection of civilians, including by promoting and implementing the relevant and applicable legal and policy frameworks. It is important that efforts are made to ensure accountability for violations, including condemning those who violate international humanitarian law. We believe that accountability mechanisms at domestic levels are essential. Broader regional and international mechanisms should continue to support these based on the principles of complementarity and subsidiarity. Finally, we commend the continued efforts of UN peacekeeping operations where mandated in the protection of civilians and the promotion and protection of human rights in situations of armed conflicts in collaboration with the host states. Peacekeeping and humanitarian organizations should undertake activities that complement the protection cluster's response. Therefore, interaction and dialogue between these two different actors is essential for improving and strengthening their respective protective mechanisms. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of South Africa for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Armenia.
Thank you. I'd like to express my appreciation to the United States delegation for convening the Security Council open debate on the subject of the protection of civilians in armed conflict. I thank today's briefers for outlining the pressing humanitarian challenges and vulnerabilities that continue to persist in various parts of the world. Mr. President, having evolved out of history of human experiences of crisis and calamities, the today topic of debate is central to addressing the very many challenges and disturbing realities we continue to face. The international humanitarian law and the international human rights law shape a crucial framework for the effective protection of civilian population and infrastructure, and in this context we stress the utmost importance of full and unconditional implementation of Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols. We condemn violations of the international humanitarian law and human rights law, including attacks on humanitarian and medical personnel, schools and educational institutions, as well as violence, threats and intimidation against journalists and media workers operating in conflict settings. Armenia remains committed to protect education from attack in line with the Safe Schools Declaration, as well as the provisions outlined in the Paris Principles and the Vancouver Principles, which our country has endorsed. Mr. President, in our part of the world, we continue to face the humanitarian consequences of the premeditated military attack which Azerbaijan has openly admitted to have initiated in the fall of 2020 amidst an outbreak of an unprecedented global healthcare crisis, resulting in thousands of casualties, displacement, destruction of livelihoods, and critical civilian infrastructure. The military aggression against Nagorno-Karabakh was extensively accompanied with most disturbing instances of violations of humanitarian law, as reported and documented by various human rights institutions. In April this year, under the General Assembly agenda items on prevention of armed conflict, elimination of racism, racial discrimination, rights of peoples to self-determination, the responsibility to protect the prevention of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, and as a document of the Security Council, we circulated the interim report of the Human Rights Defender of Nagorno-Karabakh, which provides evidence about targeted attacks on civilian population and various manifestations of violation of the rights of the people of Artsakh by Azerbaijan. Amnesty International, in its recent report published last week, revealed the magnitude of the disproportionate impact upon older ethnic Armenian population who became particular targets of war crimes by Azerbaijani military forces, including extrajudicial killings and torture in detention. The systematic violent acts and provocations that seek to disrupt the normalcy of life in the border areas extend to deliberate arsons of pastures, indiscriminate shootings, cattle raiding, disruption of gas supply, and other forms of hostile conduct intended to intimidate the civilians and deprive them of their basic human rights. Equally disturbing are the attempts to instrumentalize the issue of POWs and civilian captives, whose return Azerbaijan continues to deny in violation of Geneva Conventions and in defiance of provisional measures issued by the International Court of Justice as a matter of urgency on 7 December 2021. The persistent aggressive actions accompanied with violent rhetoric of open military threats, distorted interpretations of history, incessant territorial claims and manipulative reversals of agreed commitments should be a matter of concern to the international community. Mr. President, the obstruction of safe and unhindered humanitarian access of the UN agencies to Nagorno-Karabakh conflict zone continues to undermine efforts for comprehensive assessment and long-term humanitarian response to the needs of the civilian population. In delivering relief and assistance in situations where the right to life and human dignity are under imminent threat, it remains a critical priority for the United Nations system to adequately address in a timely manner the issue of humanitarian access to the people on the ground without discrimination and leaving no one behind. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Armenia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Well, Mr. President, I thank the United States for convening this important meeting. I'd also like to thank distinguished speakers and pay tribute to the continued efforts for protection of civilians under the leadership of the United Nations and the International Committee of the Red Cross. The global trend on protection of civilians is disturbing, conflict continues to cause civilian deaths and injuries, sexual violence, family separation, and disappearance. The safety of medical and humanitarian personnel and their facilities remains at high risk. This Council must use its influence to the fullest extent to facilitate the implementation of the relevant resolutions and to ensure that the key provisions of international humanitarian law are respected. Mr. President, while there may be some room to improve the monitoring and reporting on humanitarian access, there are no easy practical solutions or mechanisms that could effectively counter systematic denial of access by the parties to ongoing conflict, who rarely agree and respect unimpeded access. Realizing the ceasefire is of utmost importance. In view of unbearable civilian suffering in Ukraine, Russia must immediately cease the hostilities against Ukraine and fully implement a General Assembly Resolution ES-11/2 of March the 24th and the relevant Human Rights Council resolutions. Since the invasion, Japan's emergency humanitarian assistance for Ukraine and neighboring countries amounts up to $200 million in total. Japan will continue to stand by the people of Ukraine. Countering obstructions of humanitarian access is crucial, but is not enough. The international community should act in a timely manner to allow humanitarian actors to surge once obstacles to humanitarian access have been cleared. Following the first nationwide truce in 6 years in Yemen, Japan decided on May the 10th to provide $10 million through the World Food Program in response to the food crisis in the country. And this assistance is expected to make much difference against the backdrop of rising food prices. To support internally displaced persons affected by conflict in northern Ethiopia, Japan provided $12.4 million in December 2021, as soon as the access to humanitarian assistance had been improved. Mr. President, Japan is determined to continue making every effort for the protection of civilians in armed conflict. We will work closely with other member states, the United Nations system, international humanitarian organizations, and civil society organizations to contribute in this endeavor. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Morocco.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Mr. President. Please allow me to, first of all, thank the American presidency of the Security Council for convening this open debate on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. I'd like to also thank the briefers for their presentations. Our meeting today is very timely. It coincides with the international situation, which is very fluid, and it requires that all stakeholders have to ensure full respect for the international humanitarian law and the international human rights law. Since the adoption of Security Council 1275 in 1999, it introduced the protection of civilians on its agenda. Since then, the Council has tried to protection the framework for security protection in armed conflict and enabled saving numerous lives. Nonetheless, if we take a look at the situation with civilian protection now, we can see that it continues registering the greatest number of victims, despite the devastating effect of the pandemic. In addition to that, the international community is also facing political, economic, security, and environmental crises, and humanitarian ones as well, etc., etc. The list goes on. Unfortunately, within the context of the current armed conflict, it's usually all of these things at the same time. In addition to the growing number of conflicts in which extremist and armed groups, non-state actors participate, this makes protecting the civilians all the more difficult. as well as attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. And this transformed this into a complex phenomenon, which is constantly changing and is very complicated. Mr. President, I would like to raise the following points. First, we reiterate that the protection of civilians is something that belongs to states, but in a period of conflict, the capacity of some states is not enough, or sometimes it's not even there. In this case, it is imperative to ensure that the UN system, within its mandate, and the peacekeeping operations which are mandated, have to play an important role in support of member states. Similarly, missions have to have adequate protection mechanisms to make sure that civilians are not targeted by armed groups. 2, humanitarian action within civilian protection has to clearly disassociated from political objectives and placed in such a way that it's not used by any of the parties to the conflict. Third point, it's fundamental to protect the humanitarians and ensure the supply of humanitarian assistance to the populations in the greatest need of it. 4, Morocco firmly condemns the targeting of civilian infrastructure, including schools and medical facilities, and we underscore the need to fully implement the relevant resolutions of Security Council on this matter. 5, all of the parties have to comply with the international humanitarian law, discharge their civilian protection obligations, and ensure that there is access and provision of humanitarian assistance to the beneficiaries. The need to deal with devastating impact of the conflict on the civilians, in particular on the most vulnerable one in this society, is primordial in international humanitarian law. In all conflicts, this includes non-state actors. 6, accountability for all violation of humanitarian laws. This has to continue being a fundamental element for any and all strategy of civilian protection. 7, and lastly, it would be desirable that the protection of civilians is part of a long-term approach beyond the emergency in question. A preventive approach, therefore, has to be promoted, which systematically links with the issues of development, with the post-conflict recovery and peace building. This remains key. To conclude, the Kingdom of Morocco welcomes all those who place the protection of civilians in armed conflict and would like to use this opportunity to pay the tribute that they richly deserve. I thank you.
Morocco for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. President, the protection of civilians in armed conflicts is a fundamental principle of humanitarian law. However, the international community is witness to the non-compliance of international humanitarian law, as well as the lack of accountability for its grave violations. According to a recent report by the UN Secretary General, armed conflicts continue to be characterized by a high number of civilian deaths, injuries, and displacements, as well as damaged and eroded critical infrastructure such as water, sanitation, electricity, and health services, as well as deprivation and hunger. Moreover, medical and humanitarian workers continue to be targeted in different parts of the world. The COVID-19 pandemic has also exacerbated human suffering and placed additional strains on already overburdened healthcare systems. Vaccines, according to the report, have helped many parts of the world control the pandemic. However, their distribution remains deeply unequal. Nearly 3 billion people are still awaiting for their first shot, many of whom live in conflict areas with weakened health systems. Climate change has also exacerbated the conflict-related vulnerabilities, such as food insecurity. In addition, sanctions on humanitarian activities, such as obstruction of humanitarian access, bring about negative consequences for civilians in need. Mr. President, conflicts have had devastating effects on our volatile region, the Middle East, where international humanitarian law is being flagrantly violated.
In Yemen, according to a report of the Secretary General, attacks against schools, hospitals, telecommunications infrastructure, roads, factories, houses, and other civilian objects have resulted in acute food insecurity, which has worsened with an 8% increase in the number of people in need compared to early 2021. Similarly, the humanitarian situation in Palestine has deteriorated as a result of the Israeli regime's decades of occupation and apartheid policies. The systematic mass killing of civilians, including women and children, continues, with the occupied Palestinian territory having the highest number of injured healthcare workers in the world. In Gaza, infrastructure has been damaged and Palestinians have been deprived of basic services due to the illegal blockade. In Syria, continuing occupation, terrorism, and unilateral sanctions have displaced millions of people, damaged infrastructures, limited access to vital resources, and disrupted trade and supply of food and agricultural products. Against this backdrop, I would like to emphasize the following points. 1. Humanitarian assistance must not be politicized under any circumstances. 2. Providing protection specifically to those who are most vulnerable, such as women and children, during armed conflicts is critical. In this regard, unilateral sanctions which hamper humanitarian aid delivery in various ways must be lifted immediately. 3. All medical and humanitarian personnel must be protected. 4. It is necessary to ensure that international humanitarian law is respected, particularly the 1949 Geneva Conventions and additional protocols, which serve as the cornerstone of the legal framework for the protection of civilians. 5. In order to protect civilians, military intervention, including blockade, as well as foreign occupation, must come to an end. Furthermore, the achievement of a long-term political solution is the only way to keep civilians safe from harm and suffering. In this regard, states must fulfill their obligations under international law to prevent and resolve conflicts peacefully. 6. It is of paramount importance that the UN, in particular the Security Council, demand that the conflicting parties honor their obligations and respect international humanitarian law in order to spare civilians from further hardships. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, let me begin by thanking the delegation of the United States for organizing this important debate and by expressing my appreciation to all briefers for their interesting and thought-provoking contributions. Poland aligns itself with the statements delivered by the European Union and by Switzerland on behalf of the Group of Friends of Protection of Civilians in Armed Conflicts. Excellencies, a very disturbing picture emerges from the Secretary General's report on the state of protection of civilians in armed conflict in 2021. Thousands of civilian deaths, injuries, destroyed homes, attacks on basic civilian infrastructure, refugee crisis. These are the horrific consequences of armed conflicts around the world. Poland remains concerned about the harm inflicted on civilians during active hostilities in populated urban areas. Excellencies, effective protection demands more focus on vulnerable groups, including women, children, young persons with disabilities, and IDPs, as they suffer most devastating and disproportionate consequences of armed conflicts. Russian war against Ukraine has reminded us that children are always particularly affected during conflicts. In addition to the direct threat to their lives and health and massive displacement, across Ukraine, hundreds of schools have been destroyed or severely damaged by Russian shelling and airstrikes. Landmines and explosive remnants of war left behind by Russian troops pose the deadly threat to civilians, including children. Unfortunately, also persons with disabilities caught up in conflict face multiple obstacles, including limited access to humanitarian assistance, healthcare services, education, or psychological support. We should use the upcoming third anniversary of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2475, initiated by Poland and the United Kingdom, to reiterate our commitment to alleviate the suffering of persons with disabilities and do better in making sure that they are not discriminated in any way and that their specific needs are adequately addressed in humanitarian responses. Excellencies, according to UNHCR, more than 100 million people globally have been forced to flee war, violence, persecution, and discrimination. It is the highest figure on record. Among them are 14 million people in Ukraine who were forced to flee their homes as a result of the Russian aggression. Just within 3 months, 8 million persons have been internally displaced, and another 6 million have left Ukraine to seek refuge in neighboring countries, including Poland, where the number of persons who crossed the Ukrainian-Polish border since February 24th has exceeded 3.4 million. We support the appeal of UN High Commissioner for Refugees, who stated that the number of people displaced globally should serve as a wake-up call for more action to promote peace and address all causes of forced displacement. Excellencies, we must underline that under Common Article 1 of the 4 Geneva Conventions, state parties are obliged to respect and ensure respect for IHL in all circumstances. Fighting impunity for the violations of international humanitarian law is indispensable for delivering justice to victims. Despite this clear and unconditional international obligation, during the last 3 months, Russia deliberately created a humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine and blatantly disregarded the principles of international humanitarian law and human rights law by committing war crimes in Ukraine. We, as the international community, must ensure that those responsible for these crimes are held accountable. Poland, on its part, closely cooperates with the ICC Office of the Prosecutor in the investigation into the situation in Ukraine and simultaneously carries out domestic investigation into Russia's crime of war of aggression against Ukraine, which is penalized under Polish law. Besides, together with Ukraine and Lithuania, we have also established a joint investigation team which operates within the framework of Eurojust in order to collect and preserve evidence of crimes committed in Ukraine. We call on Russia to abide by the legally binding decision of the ICJ issued on March 16th on provisional measures in the case of Ukraine versus Russia. We welcome the establishment by the UNHRC of an independent commission of inquiry on Ukraine. Mr. President, our discussion coincides with the 6th anniversary of the unanimous adoption by this Council, Resolution 2286 on protection of healthcare in conflict. During yesterday's side event on practical actions for implementing the said resolution, co-organized by Poland, the still existing and even expanding gap between the principles and reality was pointed out. Thus, we need to enhance our support and advocacy towards full compliance with international humanitarian law obligation. In closing, let me emphasize that the international humanitarian law is one of the greatest achievements of the international community in its efforts to reduce suffering of civilians during armed conflicts. But it can only remain to be our common achievement if we all are respecting its principles, fully complying with its provisions, and ensuring accountability for its violations. Poland remains committed to doing its part and to contribute to initiatives and activities aimed at protection of civilians in armed conflicts. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for her statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Italy.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today's open debate comes at a critical point for the protection of civilians. The unjustified and unprovoked aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine adds up to several ongoing conflicts all over the world. Italy aligns itself with the statements delivered by the European Union and by the Group of Friends on the Protection of Civilians in Armed Conflicts. We also would like to thank the Secretary General for his annual report on the protection of civilians. As stated in the UN Security Council Resolution 2573, approved only a year ago and co-sponsored by Italy, all parties to armed conflicts should distinguish between civilian population and objectives on one hand, and combatants and military objectives on the other. Nonetheless, just a few weeks ago, 60 people died in the region of Lugansk, where a school was bombarded by the Russian army. This is only one last example of how cities have sadly become the battlefields of our time and on how civilians and civilian infrastructures are frequently targeted. We are particularly concerned about the use of explosive weapons in densely populated areas. We therefore support the ongoing negotiations in Geneva aimed to introducing a political declaration to ban their use. Mr. President, it is crucial to find ways to guarantee the full respect of international humanitarian law and to ensure safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access to the population in need. Too many times we have agreed on universal principles to protect civilians and save lives. We cannot allow that the important resolutions remain empty words. We need to discuss and find practical solutions. Let me raise 3 points as food for thoughts for further reflection. First, if and when the Council is not able to agree on a ceasefire, the UN should be able to quickly step in, at least to allow humanitarian corridors and humanitarian access, fully abiding by the humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality, independence, and humanity. In this sense, the evacuation mechanism established in Mariupol, thanks to the coordination efforts of the UN and the ICRC, is a clear example of how the international humanitarian law cannot be left to the mere spontaneous initiative of armed and non-armed groups. Italy supports a more proactive role of the UN in fostering international humanitarian obligations and in monitoring their implementation. The addition of a new ad hoc protocol to 1949 Geneva Conventions might provide a normative framework specific for such UN coordination mechanism focused on humanitarian corridors and humanitarian access. It would also spur a reinforced international commitment towards the protection of civilians. Second, from a national perspective, it is of paramount importance that the protection of civilians be prioritized in the planning and execution of all military operations and be enshrined in all national military guidelines. Providing combatants with targeted training on humanitarian access and humanitarian corridors can have indeed a positive effect on IHL compliance. Third, Italy strongly believes that the presence of women personnel in the military, too, can have a significant positive impact on the protection of civilians. Women have proved to be successful in creating trust, which is at the core of agreed humanitarian access and corridors. Mr. President, let me conclude by emphasizing a final cornerstone of the protection of civilians: accountability. In this perspective, Italy calls on the international community to guarantee accountability for the perpetrators of severe breaches of IHL. We reaffirm our full support for the work of independent international and domestic investigative institutions to avert any form of impunity. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Italy for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Nepal.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I begin by thanking the Presidency of the United States for convening today's open debate on protection of civilians in armed conflict. I thank the distinguished briefers for their comprehensive and insightful briefings this morning. Mr. President, protection of civilians is at the core of the work and purposes of the United Nations. However, the challenges of protecting civilians continuously persist as long as the protracted conflicts exist and new conflicts emerge. We see a record level of civilian casualties, forced displacement, human rights violations, and deprivation in past years and recent times. The Secretary General's report presented the gloomy picture of conflicts resulting thousands of deaths, 84 million people forcibly displaced, and 9,797 civilians casualties only from explosives, and 140 million with acute food insecurity, among others. We must ensure compliance with applicable international law, relevant Security Council decisions in the conduct of armed conflict, access to humanitarian assistance, and protection of forcibly displaced persons, women and children. The well-resourced United Nations peace operations could implement these mandates on the ground. Mr. President, devastating distress inflicted upon innocent civilians is deplorable. We strongly condemn the indiscriminate attack on civilians and civilian infrastructures by all parties in conflict. We must end the deliberate targeting of civilians in situations of armed conflict. The state has the primary responsibility to protect its civilians and prevent violence against them. Capacity of the national government on the implementation of international humanitarian, human rights, and refugee law should be strengthened to take the responsibility. The primacy of politics and preference for preventive diplomacy should be upheld to address the root causes of conflict. Mr. President, with its own experience of nationally led peace process, Nepal underscores the significance of promoting political dialogue, social harmony, and understanding for the protection of civilians during conflict as well as post-conflict reconstruction. Involvement of local community leaders and organizations in peacekeeping and peace building is necessary, and investment in education, awareness-raising programs, and employment generation are critical. Similarly, inclusive and representative state structure helps building social justice and enduring peace. Nepal has always been supportive of UN normative framework aimed at safeguarding and protecting civilians in armed conflict. Currently, Nepal is the second largest troop and police contributing country for the UN peace operations, and we provide high-quality pre-deployment and in-theater training to our peacekeepers on applicable international humanitarian and human rights law to protect civilians on the ground. And to deliver the best on the ground, protection of civilian mandate should be treated as a whole-of-mission approach supported by adequate financial and human resources. We emphasize national ownership and political solutions for preventing countries from relapsing to conflict during mission transition and withdrawal. And to conclude, Mr. President, protection of civilians during armed conflict is a challenging task for the United Nations, and oftentimes success of the United Nations is judged on the success of the protection of civilians on the ground, and we must ensure that the UN must succeed in its responsibility, and Nepal is committed to taking up its role as one of the largest TPCCs to do its best to execute the Council's mandate to protect civilians in the conflict areas. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Nepal for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I also recognize the representative of Putin's regime in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. Ukraine aligns itself with the statements made by the European Union and by Switzerland on behalf of the group of friends of the protection of civilians in armed conflict. I would like to thank the United States for organizing this important debate, as well as all briefers for their presentations. I would also like to express our U.S. friends our sincere condolences over the terrible tragedy in Texas. Dear colleagues, civilians and their rights are among the first to be hit by any war. Now in Ukraine, millions of civilians, Ukrainians and foreigners, are struggling not just for their rights, but rather for their lives. Russian troops continue indiscriminate attacks on Ukrainian cities with missile strikes and heavy artillery, including the last night. Dozens of thousands of civilians lost their lives, many more were wounded. Nearly 220,000 people lost their homes. Millions of Ukrainian citizens were forced to flee occupied or war-affected areas. 8 million have become IDPs and 6.5 million left Ukraine as refugees. This is the worst refugee crisis in Europe since the end of the Second World War. And we have no doubt that in Russian war strategies, this refugee crisis was envisaged as one of the welcoming outcomes, as well as food crisis, by the way. What Russia underestimated was the readiness to help, hospitality and commitment by our neighbors and other friends, and we reiterate our gratitude to all of them. We appreciate good offices of the Secretary General on humanitarian assistance and evacuation of civilians from the war-affected areas. Civilian population of Ukraine in the occupied and war-affected areas remain extremely vulnerable to the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Russian troops on the regular basis. Killings, torture and illegal detention, forcible deportation, deprivation of property rights, alarming human rights violations in the occupied territories, attacks against civilian infrastructure throughout Ukraine, expropriation of grain from the local farmers. This is not a complete list of Russian crimes against civilians in Ukraine. Abduction of at least 230,000 Ukrainian children, among 1.4 million of Ukrainian citizens forcibly deported to Russia, is a crime aimed at destroying the Ukrainian nation by depriving it of young generations, which is a modern manifestation of colonialism. Mr. President, Russia attacks Ukrainian civilians deliberately as a part of its Nazi-style war strategy. At the same time, these atrocities are committed by individuals, and every one of them has a name. The day before yesterday, the Ukrainian court sentenced Russian serviceman Vadim Shishimarin to life imprisonment for killing of an unarmed civilian in Sumy region at the beginning of the invasion. Yesterday, the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine announced 5 Russian servicemen and 3 members of the paramilitary Wagner Group were identified as suspects of abduction, torture, and killing of head of the village of Matyzhin in Kiev region, Olga Sukhenko, her husband, and her son. We reiterate that those ordered, committed, and whitewashed crimes against civilians will not escape justice, and we call upon all member states to engage actively in the process of ensuring justice for all the civilians suffered by Russia's atrocities. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for his statement. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me at the outset to congratulate the United States for its presidency of the Council and for convening this open debate on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. Allow me also to convey our condolences to you for the tragic loss of lives in Texas. Also allow me to thank the Secretary General for both his report on the protection of civilians in armed conflict and his 2018 report on the protection of Palestinian civilians that remains of acute relevance. I also would like to thank the representative of the ICRC for their statement. Mr. President, the entire IHL edifice was built with the primary objective of protecting those who do not take part or have stopped taking part in hostilities, and yet in Palestine, those are the primary victims of the Israeli occupation, our civilians, our prisoners, our wounded and sick. In the words of the former UN resident coordinator and humanitarian coordinator for the occupied Palestinian territory, the situation in Palestine is, and I quote, the most long-standing protection crisis in the UN's history, end of quotation, and one might add, with no end in sight. Every day is a stark reminder that our people are left defenseless in the face of repeated attacks by Israeli occupation forces and settlers. Nowhere are our people safe, not in their homes, not in their schools, not in the streets, not in the UN buildings, not in hospitals. No one is safe, not a child, not a woman, not a man, not a humanitarian worker, not a farmer, and certainly, as recent events have demonstrated, not a journalist. Shireen dedicated her life to giving voice to victims until she became one herself. She dedicated her life to telling the stories of Palestinians, and her killing is unfortunately an integral part of the Palestinian story, a story of being under threat at any and every point of your life, and for not finding peace even in your death, as even her funeral was attacked. But also a story of resilience of an entire nation that will not surrender to captivity, the nation that mourned and honored Shireen in Jerusalem and everywhere. This insecurity endured by an entire nation in its flesh is a direct result of full-scale Israeli impunity. Accountability remains the best form of protection and the most effective deterrent against the targeting of our civilians and recurrence of crimes. Israeli leaders, soldiers, settlers know they enjoy blanket immunity when it comes to their crimes against the Palestinian people. They commit them in broad daylight, shamelessly and repeatedly. Mr. President, the Security Council called almost 20 years ago for the confiscation of arms of Israeli settlers with the aim of preventing illegal acts of violence by them, as well as for measures to be taken to guarantee the safety and protection of the Palestinian civilians throughout the occupied territory, including inter alia, a temporary international or foreign presence. Here I'm referring to Resolution 904. This resolution, as many others, was never implemented, and even the temporary international presence in Hebron, Al-Khalil, was expelled by Israel. This is part of the ongoing Israeli war. Any witness of its crimes and any effort to bring them to an end. Israel has denied visas to the international staff of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. It has attacked and killed journalists. It has assaulted and killed members of the International Solidarity Movement. It has arrested and killed human rights defenders and has designated Palestinian NGOs, including those defending human rights and pursuing accountability, as terrorist organizations. The General Assembly in 2021, echoing Security Council Resolution 904, called for measures to be taken to guarantee the safety and protection of the Palestinian civilians in the occupied territory, and recalled in this regard the report of the Secretary General on the protection of the Palestinian civilian population, welcoming his observations, including with respect to the expansion of existing protection mechanisms to prevent and deter violations. We call on the Secretary General to implement without delay his proposals, notably by ensuring more visible and effective international presence on the ground to ensure protection of the Palestinian people. Mr. President, while we call for immediate action to avail the Palestinian people the protection they are entitled to, we stress that the Palestinian people will only be truly safe when they fulfill their right to self-determination and Israel's illegal occupation is brought to an end. The calls to uphold international law and the UN Charter cannot coexist with refusing to hold accountable an Israeli occupation that systematically rewards and shields the killers and accuses and punishes their victims. Enough with denied justice, enough with selective justice, enough with delayed justice. Why would the pursuit of justice be compatible with and even indispensable to the pursuit of peace everywhere except in Palestine? Experience has confirmed, including in Palestine, that without justice there can be no peace. And I thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Bangladesh.
Mr. President, I thank the U.S. presidency for convening today's debate on this important issue. I also thank the briefers for their insightful presentations. My delegation aligns itself with the statement made by Switzerland on behalf of the Group of Friends on Protection of Civilians. Mr. President, the protection of civilians lies at the heart of the United Nations work. Yet, civilians globally continue to face increased risk due to ongoing conflicts, humanitarian crisis, and forced displacement, which reached over 100 million last week. While responding to these needs, humanitarian workers and the peacekeepers face multiple challenges, including attacks against them. As noted in the report of the Secretary General, access remains a serious challenge in many parts of the world, where civilians caught up in conflict situations bear the brunt. In the context of the foregoing, this debate is certainly very timely. Mr. President, protection of civilians is an important national priority for Bangladesh, and we remain committed to all efforts to strengthen POC. Nearly 7,000 peacekeepers from Bangladesh are serving in some of the most challenging missions, providing security at civilian sites, ensuring unhindered humanitarian services, supporting delivery of health and social services, community engagement, and also working for the empowerment of women and the youth. We are also providing shelter and protection to over 1 million forcibly displaced Rohingya civilians who fled atrocities and persecution in Myanmar. We remain concerned that the situation in Myanmar continues to remain unsafe for civilians, especially for the ethnic and religious minorities such as the Rohingyas. The continued defiance of Myanmar authorities to grant access to UN and other humanitarian actors is a stark reminder of a failure to uphold even the most fundamental tenets of the protection of civilians. We reiterate our call for more decisive actions by the Security Council to ensure protection of civilians at risk in that country. Mr. President, allow me to highlight 3 specific points. First, respect for and full compliance of international humanitarian law by all parties to conflict must be ensured. We need to step up efforts to raise awareness across all stakeholders on IHL obligations and those arising from Security Council resolutions such as Resolution 2286 on protection of medical personnel and Resolution 2573 on protection of critical civilian infrastructure. ICRC and relevant UN agencies working on the ground have a critical role to play in this regard, and local organizations working at the grassroots level also need to be supported in this regard. At the same time, the Security Council itself needs to use its tools, including the sanctions regime, to address and prevent recurrence of attacks against civilians, civilian infrastructure, and other soft targets such as schools and hospitals. Secondly, ensuring safety and security of the peacekeepers and the humanitarian workers is also critically important. Attacks against the peacekeepers and aid workers are often instigated by misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech, including through online platforms. The relevant UN entities need to develop effective communication strategy to combat this phenomenon. The peacekeeping missions should be adequately resourced and equipped to fulfill their POC mandates, including through community engagement and intelligence gathering and analysis, among others. The Security Council needs to factor these issues while setting the mandates of the peacekeeping missions. Third and finally, Mr. President, we have to break the culture of impunity and hold perpetrators accountable for violation of international humanitarian law. Targeting civilians, schools, hospitals, and humanitarian actors cannot be condoned under any pretext. These attacks must be investigated and accounted for. In this regard, we recall Security Council Resolution 2601 on protecting the protectors and call for its effective implementation. While it is critically important to strengthen national judicial institutions in the host countries, the Council also needs to support international accountability mechanisms, including the ICJ and ICC, and thus send the right message to the perpetrators. Mr. President, as a POC champion, we remain committed to do our part and contribute in all efforts to the protection of civilians. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Bangladesh for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Maldives.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the United States for convening today's debate on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. I would also like to thank our briefers for their important insight and Secretary General for his report. Mr. President, armed conflicts have deep and far-reaching consequences, particularly for civilians. Our priority and the mandate of this very council is the maintenance of international peace and security. Thus, first and foremost, our goal must be avoid armed conflict through effective dialogue and engagement multilateralism. This must always be our highest priority. However, when conflict does arise, it is absolutely crucial for all parties to the conflict, including state and non-state actors, to comply fully with their obligation under international humanitarian law and ensure the protection of our civilians. In recent years, in conflict the world over, we have seen disturbing reports, videos, and other evidence of attack on civilians, including attack on schools, medical facilities, media, journalists, as well as on housing and shelters. Humanitarian workers have also come under attack. Maldives forcefully condemned the targeting of civilians and emphasized the need for full and effective implementation of relevant international obligations on the protection of civilian infrastructure. These attacks result in not in just death, but also psychological, mental health trauma and conditions where sexual violence, disappearance, and family separation are rife. At the same time, conflict causes damage to infrastructure and undermines vital civil services such as water, sanitation, electricity, healthcare that can lead to further negative consequences. This is particularly distressing given the current global pandemic. Mr. President, care must also be taken to ensure that we do not rush into the judgment based on the limited facts and misinformation. In many of these cases, these issues must not be adjudicated in the media, and it is vital to collect all information and proceed judiciously using internationally agreed mechanism and framework. In this regard, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. We need countries to meet their existing obligation under international humanitarian law. The words of the esteemed jurist and Chief United States prosecutor at the Hamburg, Robert H. Jackson, are precisely relevant to this point, where he eloquently stated, and I quote, "It is futile to think that we can have an international law that is always working on our side, and it is futile to think that we can have international court that will always render the decision we want to promote our interests. We cannot successfully cooperate with the rest of the world in establishing a regime of law unless we are prepared to have that law sometimes operated against what would be our national advantage," unquote. No power will come from above to enforce these international rules and norms. Our multilateral systems require that we take a principled approach to violence, a system where political motive guides and cases and issues are further persuaded. We will work to undermine instead of blustering our effort to address violence, and this must be avoided. Mr. President, we also agree those who are yet to ratify Roman Statute to do so, to demonstrate their fundamental commitment to the rule of law, peace and security, and commitment to prevent the most serious crime under international law: genocide, crime against humanity, war crime, and the crime of aggression. By having more countries in the ICC, we can work to make our international criminal justice system more universal and provide access for all. Again, the work of ICC and prosecutor must be independent and not influenced by political interests. Otherwise, we risk undermining one of the key tools we have in our arsenal to protect the right of civilians in armed conflict situations. Mr. President, Maldives as a small country has always placed the utmost importance on the respect and adherence to international law, the UN Charter, the rules and the norms of our multilateral system. In situations of armed conflict, we have no winners. Therefore, we must work with renewed vigor to prevent conflict, and in those situations where armed conflict is taking place, to guarantee that parties ensure the protection of civilians. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Maldives for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Costa Rica.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, As we commemorate the Protection of Civilians Week, Costa Rica recognizes and deplores the appalling human cost that armed conflicts continue to inflict on innocent girls, boys, women, and men caught during hostilities. In this regard, allow me to point out two aspects. First, Costa Rica regrets that this Council continues to fail to comply with the mandate contained in Article 26 of the UN Charter. In 2021, for the first time in history, global military spending increased to over $2 trillion. For the first, we can expect that without a proportionate regulation effort, this will result in an increase in the kind of diversion that Article 26 was established to reduce, with consequent impacts on conflict and armed violence. Therefore, it is more urgent than ever for the Security Council, with the assistance of the Military Staff Committee, to submit plans for a system to regulate armament. This should include a more robust effort to monitor and enforce Security Council arms embargoes at the national and regional levels, and a greater role for United Nations actors such as peacekeeping missions and their troop-contributing countries to conduct arms and ammunition monitoring and share such information with sanctions panels, as they are mandated to do, but currently do not robustly do. These steps, complemented by substantial and more transparent risk assessments of arms and ammunition transfers, can help resolve the contradiction between our efforts to protect civilians and the effects of the uncontrolled proliferation and misuse of conventional weapons and their munition. Costa Rica believes that disarmament starts at the beginning of the life cycle of weapons, and with the decision not to produce or acquire them in the first place. Second, the use of cyber operations as a means or method of warfare in armed conflict poses a real risk to the detriment of civilians and critical infrastructure. Power grids, sewage systems, and hospitals remain vulnerable to cyber attacks, with grave humanitarian consequences. This is a novel threat that requires novel solutions and a better understanding of our conception of the protection of civilians adapted to the digital age. Costa Rica calls for the strengthening of commitments for the protection of critical infrastructure, including an understanding of the applicability of international law in protecting civilians from cyber operations in the context of armed conflict. President, according to the World Bank, by 2021, 55% of the global population will be living in cities, or rather has lived in cities. By 2050, it is estimated that this figure will increase to 70%. Therefore, the impact of uncontrolled production and proliferation of weapons and their ammunition and the intensity of cyber attacks against civilian infrastructure will increasingly fall on populations living in densely populated areas. Costa Rica calls on this Council to recognize and adopt the necessary means to prevent such scenarios and demonstrate its commitment through concrete and sustained actions. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Costa Rica for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Argentina.
Señor Presidente.
President, since the inclusion of protection of civilians as an issue on the agenda of the Security Council in 1999, this has been one of the thematic priorities of the Security Council. It is essential for the Council to continue committed to this topic through promoting full respect of international law, especially international humanitarian law, human rights law, and refugee law. We thank the Secretary General for his report on the protection of civilians in armed conflicts, and we value its recommendations and conclusions. We deplore the fact that armed conflicts continue to feature a high level of deaths, injury, sexual violence, torture, separation of families, and disappearances. 55% of the world population today lives in urban areas. Hostilities in populated areas increase the risk of death and injury for civilians, especially when exclusive weapons are used in combat. In 2021, over 1,000 incidents were recorded using explosive weapons in populated areas, which led to over 10,000 victims. In this context, it is urgent for parties to avoid the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. It is also necessary to continue including and strengthening protection of civilian activities in the mandates of United Nations missions on the ground. In this regard, our understanding is that the protection of civilians is a comprehensive effort of the entire mission, requiring as a first crucial measure close cooperation between the military, police, and civilian components of the mission, in coordination with governments and local communities and humanitarian organizations on the ground. The use of force to respond to threats of physical violence against civilians must be authorized in accordance with the applicable legal obligations, the mandate established by the Security Council, and the specific rules of engagement of each mission. Regardless of how armed actors undertake their operations, international humanitarian law obliges parties to a conflict to enable and facilitate access of humanitarian assistance to the affected areas and civilians in need. Attacks against humanitarian personnel and unreasonable bureaucratic roadblocks are unwarranted obstacles to providing humanitarian assistance. We deplore the fact that 6 years after the adoption of Resolution 2286, medical personnel, transportation, and facilities continue to be attacked in armed conflict. According to the report of the Secretary General, during 2021, health personnel, facilities, equipment, and transportation were the object of attacks, and parties interfered with medical care. During 2020 and 2021, the spread of COVID-19 pandemic had a devastating impact on countries affected by armed conflicts. This situation called the Council to adopt Resolution 2565, calling for all parties to a conflict to immediately implement a sustained, lasting humanitarian pause to facilitate equitable, safe distribution of vaccines against COVID-19 in conflict-affected areas. In this context, the protection of medical personnel and infrastructure is essential to ensure the distribution of the vaccine. Another important element in the protection of civilians is investigating the facts and accountability of those who perpetrate crimes against civilians. In this regard, on the one hand, Argentina believes it timely to indicate that besides the ad hoc investigative commissions, international humanitarian law offers a tool to investigate potential grave violations of the Geneva Conventions by the impartial humanitarian Commission of Investigation provided in Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions. Over 20 years after the first Security Council resolution on the protection of civilians in armed conflicts, civilians continue to be the great majority of victims of conflict. The problem lies not in current legal frameworks, but in the translation of these standards into practice. To translate these standards of the last 20 years into demonstrable results, the Security Council must advocate a more robust implementation of the existing standards framework. Thank you.
Representative of Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President.
First of all, I would like to thank the United States for convening this open debate and to all speakers for their poignant briefing. Indeed, we are witnessing more civilians lost their lives in armed conflicts. The use of explosive weapons, especially in urban and densely populated environments, have caused devastating consequences for civilians. Homes, schools, and critical infrastructures that provide livelihood are completely destroyed, leaving those who survive in devastating conditions. Once again, the world wishes to see the Security Council exercising more of its moral weight in protecting civilians in armed conflicts, especially women and children. Having said that, allow me to underline 3 points. First, we must amplify our calls for the cessation of hostility and global ceasefire. We have been briefed many times in this Council on how the armed conflict and the pandemic worsening the humanitarian condition. To save lives of the innocent civilians in armed conflicts, cessation of hostility and ceasefire are the utmost precondition. There is no other option, and only then we can have a chance for a lasting peace. Safe passage must be guaranteed without impediment for civilians wishing to evacuate and for humanitarian personnel to deliver assistance. At the same time, respect and full compliance to the international humanitarian law must be restored, and dialogue and negotiation must be intensified. Secondly, community engagement is essential in protecting civilians. Comprehensive strategy to protect civilians should be strategic, inclusive, and anchored in people-centered approach. Local communities must become part and parcel of the development and implementation of the strategy. It should be tailor-made, and we must listen to the needs of the affected communities. In this regard, Indonesia would like to commend the approach taken in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, South Sudan, and ABA in incorporating community engagement to improve protection of civilians. As a major TPCC, Indonesia is cognizant of the expectation for peacekeepers to do more to protect civilians. Such expectations should be followed with adequate resources for them to do so. To this end, we urge Member States to pay their financial contribution in full, on time, and without condition, and the Secretariat to settle any outstanding reimbursement for the TPCC without delay. Third, women empowerment must be placed at the center of the protecting civilian policy. As agents of the protection of civilians, women bring a unique perspective and approach that enables them to gain wider access to communities. This is very essential for trust and confidence building that contributes in the peace process. As the initiator of the Resolution 2538, Indonesia believes in the important role of women peacekeepers in community engagement and thus protection of civilians. We therefore committed to increase the number of female peacekeepers. We also call to all member states for a full implementation of this resolution. Before I conclude, Mr. President, allow me to underline that protecting innocent civilians in armed conflicts is a matter of basic principle of humanity. We need to work together to always strive for peaceful solution to conflict. We therefore urge all member states to uphold the UN Charter and principles of non-use of force and respecting territorial integrity. It is our duty to ensure civilians are protected in armed conflict, and it is our shared responsibility to preserve humanity. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Indonesia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guatemala.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you very much, President. Guatemala thanks the delegation of the United States of America for convening this open debate on the protection of civilians in armed conflicts. At the same time, we are grateful for the briefings given by the distinguished panelists. We also acknowledge the concept note circulated as a basis for our discussions today, and we share what was expressed about the importance of the necessary legal basis to enable humanitarian access and the protection of humanitarian workers, a legal framework which already exists in international humanitarian law and which, unfortunately, all too frequently is flouted As a troop contributing country, and because of the importance that my delegation gives to the mandate of the protection of civilians, Guatemala is honored at having hosted the workshop for the review of the Protection of Civilians Manual for military components in peacekeeping operations of the United Nations organization. Throughout the years, we have noted the developments and strengthening of the protection of civilian component in the United Nations framework. With the first resolution of this Council on the Protection of Civilians, 1265, as a reference, as well as the various reports of the Special Committee on Peacekeeping Operations of the United Nations, or the C34, and the discussions we have conducted in the framework of the ministerial meetings on peacekeeping. Actual experience on the ground has demonstrated that we must have a comprehensive focus to protect civilians, taking into account and dealing with the various factors that have an influence on or support the various threats, including political, economic, and security. And we must also make combined efforts as a whole mission, including the civilian, police, and military component. We welcome that the current policy of the United Nations on protection of civilians clearly provides the functions and expectations of each component for the protection of civilians to be completely integrated in the planning and activities of each mission. It should be acknowledged that although the Secretariat of the United Nations, through the various policies and manuals, as well as the troop and police contributing countries, through the various memoranda of understanding, and the host countries, through the various status of forces agreements, despite all of this, there is still a large space to improve and strengthen the full implementation of the protection of civilians mandates in the framework of United Nations peacekeeping missions. President, we hope that in the near future, the Secretariat will also have a policy with a broader scope and zero caveats to ensure the full implementation of mandates on the operational level, especially with regard to the implementation of the mandate for protection of civilians in the framework of peacekeeping operations, in order to fully cooperate with humanitarian organizations and immediately assist the most vulnerable and needy populations. We also hope that the Special Committee for Peacekeeping Operations will update its mandate next year in order to further encourage one of the most important components of peacekeeping, the protection of civilians. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Guatemala for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Uruguay.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, sir. Uruguay wishes to thank the Permanent Mission of the United States for convening this open debate and making it possible for member states to share their views on the topic, as well as the panelists for their statements and contributions, particularly in the current context where we bear witness to violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. All of this in situations of armed conflict that endanger world peace and security. This delegation supports the statements of the Group of Friends of the Responsibility to Protect and the Group of Friends of the Protection of Civilians, and we wish to make some statements in our national capacity. President, Uruguay is strongly committed to the agenda of the protection of civilians in armed conflicts, and we recognize its extremely close link to the agendas of women, peace and security, and children in armed conflicts. We support the principles of protection, which were the outcome of the International Civil Conference organized by Rwanda. because of the importance of the protection of civilians, to preserve the physical and moral integrity of people in conflict, especially the most vulnerable. Our troops have been conducting protection of civilian tasks and have done so for many years. Our field experience has shown us that this is one of the tasks that bring the United Nations closest to local populations suffering from violence. Unfortunately, despite the progress in standards in recent years, as troop contributors, we can attest that the civilian population, especially women and children, continue to be affected in situations of armed conflict and post-conflict situations. When it comes to children and the protection of the right to education, bearing in mind the increase of attacks on educational institutions in 2021, we call for all member states to support the Safe Schools Declaration and the guidelines for the protection of schools and universities from military use during armed conflicts. We strongly condemn attacks against civilians, including students and teachers, as well as civilian infrastructure, including schools and universities, in accordance with Resolution 2601 of the Security Council. Turning to peace operations, we acknowledge once again the efforts made to improve the protection of civilians in the framework of the A4P initiative and its strategy for implementation, A4P+. Peaceful solutions based on the principles of justice, human rights and international law, early warning, inclusive political dialogue, strengthening state institutions, promoting sustainable economic and social development from the gender viewpoint are inseparable partners for prevention, besides being essential elements to create solid environments for protection. The conflicts we are seeing, to mention just the cases of conflict in Ukraine as well as the situation in the Middle East and several areas of Africa, are a painful demonstration of the situation in which civilians in conflict can find themselves, and the violations of the human rights and humanitarian law in general. Lastly, Uruguay calls for respect for human rights, international law, and international humanitarian law, especially the need to ensure access for humanitarian assistance and to call a halt to facilities that limit or put at risk humanitarian operations which respond to the basic needs of populations. This Council has an essential responsibility to meet these principles without prejudice to the obligations that we all have as members of the General Assembly. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Uruguay for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, first I'd like to thank you for convening today's timely open debate. One of the key elements to protect civilians in armed conflict, especially those in humanitarian crisis, is to ensure humanitarian access. The international community have repeatedly called upon all parties in armed conflicts to ensure the safe and unhindered access of humanitarian personnel and the delivery of supplies and equipment. Unfortunately, we are still witnessing deeply concerning denial of humanitarian access in armed conflicts, including in parts of Ukraine. As indicated in the report of the Secretary General this month, humanitarian activities have been continuously under pressure from a heightened level of hostilities and the increased use of explosive devices. It is simply unacceptable that more than 800 humanitarians were killed or wounded in the past 5 years, and the number surpasses 1,000 with incidents of kidnapping. Mr. President, my delegation would like to make the following comments regarding some crucial ways forward in ensuring better humanitarian access. First, my delegation urges the Security Council to strengthen its voice for ensuring humanitarian access, which is closely related with its mandate of maintaining international peace and security. We also request all UN member states to faithfully respect and act upon relevant resolutions of the UN Security Council and General Assembly. Second, the international community must redouble its sustained efforts to ensure respect for and compliance with international law, such as obligations in international humanitarian law regarding humanitarian activities, as well as accountability for those violate such obligations. All parties to armed conflict need to clearly understand what the international law dictates, and that denial of humanitarian access and attacks against humanitarian workers and objects may, under certain conditions, constitute war crimes and crime against humanity. Third, it is critical to ensure systematic documentation and evidence collection of incidents related to the denial of humanitarian access and violation of relevant international law, as well as to make such information available to the public so that any attempt to spread misinformation and disinformation can be countered. In this regard, the Republic of Korea supports all relevant efforts, including by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, the International Criminal Court, and the International Court of Justice. Mr. President, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the current situation in Ukraine. The international crisis caused by Russia's unprovoked and unjustified aggression against Ukraine has been prolonged, and it has unleashed various repercussions all over the world. The Republic of Korea has paid close attention to the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, as well as its neighboring countries. It is quite doubtful that merciless destruction of resident facilities and major infrastructure caused by Russian forces heavy shellings and missile strikes in cities of Ukraine, let alone civilian casualties, can be justified in terms of international humanitarian law. All of these situations are very concerning and miserable. The Republic of Korea has supported the international community's efforts to assist Ukraine. Among others, the Republic of Korea has provided humanitarian aid to Ukraine and will keep looking at possible ways to assist Ukraine and impacted neighbors. The desired effects of humanitarian assistance would be significantly weakened if parties to armed conflict ignore the obligations and necessity to protect civilians and relevant international norms. The Republic of Korea demands full respect for such norms and, above all, an immediate cessation of the hostilities. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Cyprus.
Mr. President, let me begin by expressing our sincere condolences for the senseless violence in Texas yesterday. Mr. President, my delegation aligns with the EU statement and wishes to make some additional remarks. We note the small reduction in civilian casualties reported by the Secretary General in the latest report. Still, the immense scale of suffering of the millions of civilians who have to survive in dire conditions, notwithstanding the clear obligations of states under international law to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure in armed conflict, remains alarming. The ongoing war in Ukraine is a demonstration of the tragic repercussions of conflict on civilians. In addition to upholding the prohibition of the use of force and ensuring a ceasefire, the Council must use all other tools at its disposal to protect civilians. In that regard, my delegation wishes to highlight the following areas of concern. First, the number of persons displaced by conflict continues to grow, with more than 80 million in 2021. We are particularly concerned about situations of protracted displacement, where we are convinced that the Council can take more robust action to ensure the right of return as early as possible, the respect for the property rights of those displaced, and the prohibition of settling other populations in areas of forced displacement. As a country subjected to all of the above, as a result of foreign aggression, we know just how powerful these phenomena are in upending the lives of civilians and solidifying the effects of the unlawful use of force. Second, the number of persons who are missing as a result of conflict is also exceedingly high, and the humanitarian nature of this issue is not always respected. We need better international cooperation frameworks and to strengthen search and identification mechanisms. We also need the Council to build on its resolutions 2474 of 2019, as well as more robust provisions in Council resolutions on situations where the fate and whereabouts of missing persons remain unknown for decades, such as in Cyprus. Third, the issue of civilians living under occupation has been largely overlooked by this Council. Many of these civilians endure daily violations of their human rights and fundamental freedoms, including privacy and family life, education, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and property rights. Moreover, the persistent harassment and intimidation of these civilians often result in indirect forced displacement and ethnic cleansing of an area's indigenous population. Fourth, accountability and the administration of international criminal justice for serious crimes is another area that presents room for improvement. The Council should consider by default the referral of situations to the ICC. At the same time, the Council should reject peace agreements that include amnesties for atrocity crimes, including sexual violence. Fifth, before closing, I wish to refer to the inextricable link between peacekeeping and the protection of civilians. We consider this component to form part of every peacekeeping operation mandate, without prejudice to the primary responsibility of host countries to protect civilians, and we would like to see the reporting and other capacity of peacekeeping operations enhanced in this regard. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Cyprus for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malaysia.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this annual open debate. I would also like to thank all briefers for their valuable interventions. Malaysia is pleased to see the Council's sustained commitment to discussing this important topic, including implementing Resolution 2286, which we supported during our membership in this Council in 2016. Mr. President, we are appalled by the continued attacks on civilians, including journalists, media workers, and humanitarian personnel in conflict situations. Impunity continues to prevail in many armed conflicts due to the persisting lack of accountability for crimes committed against civilians. In many situations, such as in the occupied Palestinian and other Arab territories, the cycle of impunity enjoyed by the occupier continues to deepen the occurrence of further violations. Malaysia continues to call on all parties to armed conflict to comply fully with their obligations under international law. We also call on parties to facilitate safe and unimpeded passage for medical and humanitarian personnel and respect the humanitarian principle of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. We also call on the State Council as guardian of peace and security to ensure the principles of the UN Charter and international law be consistently applied in all conflicts. Mr. President, the Secretary General's latest report on the protection of civilians underscores the grim reality that armed conflict continued to be characterized by high levels of civilian death, injury, and psychological trauma, sexual violence, torture, family separation, and disappearance. In these respects, I would like to focus on three central aspects that Malaysia considers of particular importance. First, my delegation continues to believe that conflict represents a systematic risk for civilians. Therefore, a ceasefire must be the first step to prevent further civilian death and injuries, followed by efforts to address the root causes of conflict in ensuring lasting peace. We continue to call on member states, particularly this Council, to honor the commitment made in supporting the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire in 2020. We also stress that prevention, de-escalation, and solution of conflict must only be achieved by peaceful means. Second, it is pivotal to recognize the critical role of diverse local civil society actors in the protection of civilians. All actors should take advantage of the expertise and perspective of local actors and communities, including meaningful engagement of women, youth, and marginalized populations in supporting unarmed self-protection efforts. This partnership should extend but not be limited to financial resources, best practices, and mechanisms that communities use to protect themselves. At the same time, Malaysia also holds the view that much more could be done to recognize the role of women and youth as agents of peace. Such recognition could further empower them to play an active role in creating and supporting a safe environment with and for the local community. Third, we need to strengthen the capacity and mandate of our peacekeepers. Malaysia concurs that the provision of civilian protection mandates by the Security Council to peacekeeping operation is vital in curbing violence inflicted against civilians. Our peacekeepers must be trained appropriately and adequately to protect civilians. We also consider operational plans and strategies in peacekeeping missions to protect civilians must be informed by an analysis of the different impacts of conflict on all populations, especially vulnerable groups. Mr. President, let me conclude by reiterating the need for us to do more to ensure the protection of civilians, including strengthening accountability against the perpetrators of human rights violations in armed conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malaysia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Let me first express my deepest condolences for the tragic murder of innocent children and teachers in Texas. Our hearts bleed from this horrific tragedy, and our prayers are with you and your country in this very, very difficult time. Mr. President, for Israel, a nation that has faced incessant conflict from the moment of our founding, the protection of civilians in armed conflict is of utmost importance. As the ancient Jewish axiom goes, whoever saves even one life, it is as if they saved an entire world. And this is the moral code by which Israel abides. Israel goes to great lengths to develop defensive technologies such as Iron Dome to protect our citizens. And this commitment to saving lives goes far beyond our borders. Recently, Israel was the first country to establish a state-of-the-art field hospital in Ukraine, providing humanitarian access to injured civilians. Yet, while Israel takes every measure to save civilian lives, the brutal terror groups who call for Israel's destruction not only target Israeli civilians, they use their own people as human shields. Hamas digs terror tunnels under hospitals and schools and uses them as weapon storage sites and rocket launch pads. This, Mr. President, is a double war crime. Almost exactly a year ago, during Operation Guardian of the Walls, over 4,000 Hamas rockets fired from densely populated residential neighborhoods in Gaza rained down on Israeli cities. But even while Israel was under fire, we worked with the UN and the international community to facilitate the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza. Tragically, Hamas targeted the crossing, preventing the aid from reaching the Palestinians in Gaza. But this is not only Hamas's modus operandi. Hezbollah, the Iran-funded terror army entrenched along Israel's northern border, now has 150 rockets pointed at Israel. Just last month, on April 25th, rockets were launched from a populated area in southern Lebanon, within UNIFIL's area of operation, towards civilian communities in northern Israel. Hezbollah's arsenal of rockets are aimed directly at our towns and our critical infrastructure. And just like Hamas, they are being stored under the cover of innocent Lebanese civilians. Mr. President, I must mention one more important remark. Just yesterday, I met Leah and Simcha Golding, the parents of Second Lieutenant Hadar Golding, who was murdered and abducted by Hamas in 2014 during a humanitarian ceasefire. I accompanied the Golding family as they met with member states to aid them in bringing their son's body home for burial. But sadly, the Goldings are not alone. For the past 8 years, Hamas has held the bodies of both Hadar Golding and Oron Shaul, who was killed and abducted a week before Hadar. Moreover, Hamas is holding 2 Israeli civilian hostages, Avera Mengistu and Hisham El-Said, without disclosing any information on their well-being. This blatant disregard for international law and deliberate targeting of civilian population must end. It must end now. Mr. President, while Israel takes every measure to protect the lives of the innocent, both of Israelis and others, the same cannot be said of those who seek our destruction. Indiscriminate rocket fire on civilian population, the use of one's own people as human shields, and holding civilians hostage must be condemned. But more than that, it must end. We urge that you all join us in condemning these acts of terror. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Croatia.
Mr. President, I have the honor of delivering statement on behalf of the group of Friends of the Responsibility to Protect, consisting of 55 member states and the European Union, this year co-chaired by Botswana, Costa Rica and Croatia. Today we bear witness to continuing and pervasive erosion of respect for civilian lives and objects, and an appalling disregard in some regions for the norms and laws that states have established to avert the impacts of armed conflict. As a result of such disregard, we are witnessing on a daily basis great levels of human suffering and high risk of mass atrocity crimes being perpetrated against civilian populations. All member states have committed to the responsibility to protect their populations from genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing. Nevertheless, we know that more than 100 million people are currently displaced as a result of conflict, atrocities and persecution worldwide. The commission of systematic, egregious and widespread violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law as applicable in situation of armed conflict endangers the peace and security of the entire world. Today's debate on the protection of civilians and safe and unhindered humanitarian access shines a critical light on a defining challenge in many situations where atrocities have already occurred or where there is a high risk of atrocities being perpetrated. In conflict setting, active hostilities severely constrain and jeopardize humanitarian operations, hindering efforts to meet the basic needs of populations. Moreover, we have increasingly witnessed UN member states and other parties to conflicts engage in deliberate denial of humanitarian access, including through blocking passage and delivery of humanitarian assistance and services, or deliberately attacking humanitarian and medical workers and assets in violation of international humanitarian law. This has an alarming impact on vulnerable civilian populations who face neglect, grave protection risks, potential starvation, and significant public health crisis and increased risk of sexual and gender-based violence, including conflict-related sexual violence. It is within this context that Group of Friends of R2P would like to stress the following points. Firstly, the Group of Friends demands that all parties allow and facilitate, in accordance with relevant provisions of international law and consistent with humanitarian principle, the full, safe, immediate and unhindered access of humanitarian personnel, equipment and supplies, and the timely delivery of humanitarian assistance to population in need, including through lifting arbitrary bureaucratic impediments to humanitarian operations, allowing the flow of humanitarian aid and services into conflict areas, and protecting humanitarian and medical actors and civilians from attack. When protecting humanitarian access to all people in need in conflict setting, in a matter of international peace and security, the Security Council should continue to play a constructive role in encouraging the protection of humanitarian access. Secondly, compliance with international law is fundamental to the protection of civilians and civilian objects. Many civilian deaths, as well as suffering and displacement, could be avoided if all parties to conflicts respect international humanitarian law and human rights. Some states have effective programs in their armed forces to comply with international humanitarian law. However, we are witnessing attacks directed against civilian infrastructure, including healthcare facilities and schools, some in violations of international humanitarian law. It is important to remember that indiscriminate attacks and attacks targeting medical facilities and civilian objects, including those indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, as well as on civilian population, including those who are humanitarian workers, may amount to war crimes. Thirdly, it is of the utmost importance that states that have yet not done so put in place appropriate legislative and institutional arrangements to comprehensively recognize and address violations of international humanitarian law and violations and abuses of human rights, and hold those who commit such violations and abuses accountable. Accountability not only helps provide justice and support for victims, but it is also key to efforts to deter future violations and abuses, and supports reconciliation process and re-establishment of peace. Appropriate legislative and institutional arrangements, as well as compliance with international humanitarian law and international human rights law, would significantly contribute to the prevention and alleviation of human suffering. Fourthly, support for the protection of civilians should be responsive to gender, age, and other core demographic considerations. Security Council resolutions on women, peace and security note that armed conflict and emergencies have a disproportionate impact on women and girls. Their needs and rights must be considered and addressed alongside their full, equal, safe and meaningful participation. The group urges the United Nations and other relevant actors to ensure that affected populations, including women and girls, are involved in the development, implementation and monitoring of civilian protection strategies and activities. Mr. President, far too many civilians are killed in both deliberate and indiscriminate attacks in today's complex and protracted conflicts. The denial of humanitarian access exacerbates risks to civilians who struggle to meet their basic needs. The international community should make every effort to protect civilians and assist those impacted by conflict. The members of the Security Council should continue to take timely and decisive action aimed at ending and preventing atrocities and not hinder credible efforts to this end. We call on members of the Security Council to respond to and address the risk of commission of mass atrocities, noting in this context the initiatives on the use of veto in cases of mass atrocities, including the French-Mexican initiative and the Accountability, Coherence and Transparency Group code of conduct. Finally, the surest way to protect civilians is by investing in the prevention of conflict and atrocity crimes through early warning and in the peaceful settlement of disputes based on the principles of justice, human rights, and international law. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Croatia for his statement. I now give the floor to the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See to the United Nations.
Mr. President, the Holy See would like to thank the United States of America for calling today's important debate, but first to express heartfelt condolences for the tragic loss of life in Uvalde, Texas. In the past few months, we have witnessed the tragic consequences of armed conflict return to Europe on a scale not seen for a generation. Faced with violence, nearly 13 million Ukrainians have fled their homes to avoid becoming casualties of war. The same reality is visible in every country and region affected by conflict and war across the globe, in the Middle East, in the Sahel, on the Horn of Africa, in Southeast Asia. Thousands upon thousands have been forced to decide whether to flee their homes or to remain in place and risk physical harm and even death. Despite the humanitization of warfare being an aspirational concept for centuries, the brunt of conflict still falls disproportionately upon the innocent and defenseless. Since first adding this item to its agenda in 1999, the Council has elaborated on protections owed to those who face heightened risks during conflict, including humanitarian personnel, healthcare workers, journalists, displaced persons, women, children, and persons with disabilities. The Council has also urged all parties to armed conflict to protect civilian infrastructure critical to the provision of essential services. The Holy See commends such efforts while underscoring the need to implement these protections fully and to further incorporate such protections in all peacekeeping mandates. In this regard, my delegation would like to offer some concrete recommendations on three key issues for the Council's consideration. First, the Holy See urges the Council to keep the protection of civilian objects high on its agenda. These include the protection for places of worship. Religious sites not only provide believers with a place where they can live their faith, but often play a crucial social, cultural, and educational role in society, and are, especially in conflict situations, a source of assistance, aid, and even protection. Places of worship are objects akin to schools or hospitals, and thus should benefit from similar protection. Second, efforts to protect civilians must respond to the secondary consequence of war and conflict, which linger long after guns fall silent. Of paramount concern is ending the production, stockpiling, and use of indiscriminate weapons, such as anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions. Such weapons, along with other explosive remnants of war, contaminate the lived environment and continue to threaten civilians with severe injury or death, even after hostilities conclude. For adequate civilian protections, greater resources are needed for programs to clear areas of unexploded ordnance. In this regard, my delegation commends the vital work of the UN Mine Action Service. Third, we express deep concern regarding the growing number of attacks on humanitarian personnel. These impede the provisions of vital assistance and, as the world continues its effort to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic, prevent widespread distribution of vaccines. Furthermore, when perpetrators escape accountability, a culture of impunity takes hold, placing more humanitarian workers at risk and weakening the rule of law more broadly. To end this cycle, greater efforts are needed by both states and this Council. In closing, the Holy See reiterates its call for all parties to conflict, state and non-state actors alike, to fully comply with international humanitarian law until that point when humankind reaches its highest aspiration, as reflected in this organization's charter, of abolishing war in all its manifestations. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See to the United Nations for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Chile.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, we express our sincere condolences to your country following the tragic events of yesterday at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. As other member states have done, we echo the expressions of solidarity with the community affected, their families, and particularly parents and brothers of the children. Chile thanks the Permanent Mission of the United States for convening this timely debate as part of the Protection of Civilians Week. We also take this opportunity to thank the Secretary-General for having presented the report on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. The protection of civilians has been a duty which has been entrusted to us. It is a duty which deserves the utmost scrutiny and commitment when we tackle it. As such, we recognize its central importance to the agenda of this body, and moreover, we urge the Council to ensure that in its discussions it continues to tackle the protection of civilians beyond the aspect of security on the ground. It should tackle the issue by focusing on a preventive approach. It should identify the root causes of conflicts, use approaches which promote the rule of law, accountability, and approaches which place the human rights of civilians at their heart. Of particular concern is the food security situation. 140 million people in 2021, last year, suffered acute food insecurity. Moreover, we continue to be alarmed at the numbers of civilian victims of IEDs, given that last year 1,234 incidents involving explosive weapons in populated areas occurred. 89% of the victims were civilians. Moreover, in the context of a global pandemic, it is reprehensible that both healthcare personnel and hospitals continue to be targeted by attacks perpetrated by actors involved in armed conflicts. We cannot let up in drawing attention to the situation of children in several areas of conflict as a result of school closures, including those school closures which were the result of attacks. These school closures have made tens of thousands of children more vulnerable because they've been forced to abandon their role as students to head to the front lines of battle. Such vulnerabilities have been exacerbated by various types of attacks. Such attacks have exposed children to greater risks of abduction, sexual violence, and recruitment, and as a consequence, have increased their risks to having their physical and mental health gravely affected in the medium and long term. President, the protection of the most vulnerable people in conflict situations depends to a great extent on the strengthening of international law, including international humanitarian law, and on strengthening the implementation of instruments such as the Vancouver Principles and the Safe Schools Declaration. Chile is a signatory to the aforementioned. We also must focus on the WPS agenda. As regards accountability measures, these measures must be applied in such a way as to place victims at the heart of all our endeavours. As such, strengthening the capacity of national institutions to provide access to justice as well as strengthening international oversight and reporting mechanisms, is vital if we are to halt impunity and the crimes that affect the most vulnerable among us. It is vital that we continue working to ensure that our contingents in peace missions are duly equipped to discharge their protection mandates. We must ensure that they have the proper tools to properly pursue their goals. This includes ensuring trainings throughout missions to mitigate the impact of operations on civilians before, during, and after any operation. To stick within my time limits, I've simply read an excerpt of our statement, and the full version has already been sent to the appropriate contacts. We wish to conclude by emphasizing that all wars make one reality patently clear. Civilians are those primarily affected by armed conflicts, particularly those civilians belonging to the most vulnerable sectors of society, such as women and children. Many thanks indeed.
I thank the representative of Chile for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I want to commend the United States for convening this timely meeting. Greece aligns itself with a statement delivered by the European Union and would like to add the following in its national capacity. We would like also to thank the Secretary General for his report, which unfortunately spread protracted armed conflicts, including the war in Ukraine, as well as longer-term factors such as climate change, the pandemic, and displacement. The international community is struggling to tackle numerous simultaneous humanitarian crises, from Ukraine to Ethiopia and from the Sahel to Myanmar, with millions of human lives at stake and with limited and overstretched resources at hand. Ongoing crises such as in Syria and Afghanistan seem no closer to resolution so many years down the road. Active conflicts and political obstacles often render even available aid undeliverable. Impeding humanitarian access, which could constitute a war crime, appears to be deliberately used in cases such as Mariupol. Yemen is another indicative example of the fragility of humanitarian access under the present circumstances. The humanitarian ceasefire, which has held for over a month now, has allowed sorely needed food aid to be delivered to some of the most vulnerable. Mr. President, in order to tackle the unprecedented humanitarian challenges we are currently faced with, no effort should be spared to ensure humanitarian access to those in need. The maintenance of humanitarian corridors is vital for saving lives, as the world has so dramatically witnessed during the Russian invasion in Ukraine. We must therefore utilize and improve donor coordination mechanisms both on the field and at political level, ensuring compliance of states and non-state actors with international humanitarian law, as well as facilitate the cooperation among states and between states and international institutions. Moreover, we need to safeguard that no attacks against civilian infrastructure take place, in particular against schools and medical facilities. In this vein, we need to give special emphasis world to the protection of civilians in armed conflict. It is our call to make sure that no attacks and crimes against them go unpunished. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Nigeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the delegation of the United States and President of the month of May 2022 for organizing today's open debate. The human as well as the social and economic impact of armed conflicts in society are massive. Terrorism and violent extremism are the most challenging forms of armed conflicts and have become serious threats to the civilian population. In recent times, schools have become target for armed conflicts, and school children and educators have become vulnerable to attacks, abuse, exploitation, and recruitment by these armed groups. The experience of COVID-19 pandemic further exacerbated the plight of these children, heightening their vulnerability and depriving them access to schools. The impact of armed conflict on education requires urgent humanitarian and governmental actions. Education in Nigeria is key to national development. The quest for development will not be possible without the analytical, inventive, and critical thinking enabled by a robust and uninterrupted education system. For this reason, Nigeria is open to every initiative that will enhance education both nationally and globally. Mr. President, Nigeria has faced attacks on schools and educational facilities in the past years by the Boko Haram, the State of West Africa, ISWAP, terrorist groups, and the activities in the northeastern part of the country has increased, including kidnapping of children for ransom. The group capitalized on the priority accorded to education by targeting soft targets, especially vulnerable students and institutions of learning. As part of the commitment to ensure the protection of schools and educational facilities, government has prioritized the integration of safe schools and protection of education into national policies. To this end, the Safe School Initiative was launched in Nigeria in 2014 at the World Economic Forum in Africa, held in Abuja. It has become a major driving force in response to the growing number of attacks on the right to education, including the kidnapping of over 200 secondary school girls in Chibok, Borno State, Nigeria. The Safe School Initiative has been a major step in driving global action to protect the learning environment. We will continue to strive to attract more countries into the coalition as it enables the transformation of school attacks from social problems to policy action. It was in this spirit that Nigeria co-sponsored the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 74/275, proclaiming September 9 every year as the International Day to protect education from attack. The resolution was adopted under Nigeria's presidency of the UN General Assembly during the 74th session. Nigeria also led the important effort to get the General Assembly to declare 24th January of every year as International Day of Education through Resolution 73/25 in 2018, consistent with our country's valuation of education. Mr. President, in framing the Safe School Initiative, we have been fortunate to benefit from the goodwill and partnership of friendly countries and corporate organizations. Nigeria hosted the 4th International Conference on Safe School Declaration in 2021 in Abuja together with our partners, Argentina, Norway, Spain, the African Union Commission, to promote global cooperation and strengthen coordination on implementing the Safe School Declaration. On this note, let me seize this moment to express Nigeria's appreciation to the United Nations for supporting the initiative through its multi-donor funding. This is also important as policies can only be successful with the collaboration of critical stakeholders in terms of capacity and finance. In Nigeria, the Safe School Initiative resulted in better fortification of schools as well as better communication with the communities. This has led to higher enrollment number in places where children had hitherto abandoned formal learning. There are also provisions under the initiative for night illumination of schools, communications devices, development of safety manual and skills, as well as the promotion of safe zones for education. These initiatives also enabled improvement in the protection of infrastructure for schools. Mr. President, education is about our common future. It is the most guaranteed enabler for a peaceful, just and prosperous world for those at risk of being left behind. I will encourage all stakeholders, most especially those experiencing threats from extremists, to learn from Nigeria's experience in this regard in protecting schools from attack. We therefore call on member states to endorse and implement the Safe School initiatives as a tool to safeguard civilians as well as the educational systems from any form of attack. We must stand together to build an educated community on a global scale. People throughout the world live in the same global village now, and our countries are more interconnected as we become a community that shares the same destiny. we can only achieve lasting stability and development through strengthened solidarity, partnership, and cooperation. To achieve a safe learning environment for our educational community globally, the entire community must take joint action against the use of schools and facilities by armed groups during conflict. The use of explosives as weapons of conflict around schools and institutions of higher learning is unacceptable because it deprives children their right to education and destroys their hopes. In conclusion, I would like to take the liberty to join all Africans to celebrate this day. The African Day is a day of celebration for Africans and the Pan-African descent all over the world. The day is also an opportunity to reflect on the progress made by the African Union in achieving its goals, especially with regard to protect the human rights and freedoms of Africans. Same as last year, the Commemoration of African Day in 2022 comes at a very difficult time with challenges posed by COVID-19 pandemic, armed conflict, climate change, violent extremism, terrorism, poverty, and hunger. Our message today will therefore focus on the need to find and amplify innovative solutions that are aimed at addressing challenges on the continent. Africa has had its fair share of armed conflict, and now is the time to put an end to such and focus on our development. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Nigeria for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Mr. President, I'm delivering these remarks on behalf of the Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. We are extremely concerned about the devastating impacts of compounding conflicts and crises on civilians around the world. As always, people in the most vulnerable and marginalized situations are impacted the most. To save lives and alleviate human suffering, there is an urgent need to end conflicts and ensure full respect for humanitarian law. With the Russian aggression against Ukraine, we are seeing an unprecedented scale of destruction of critical civilian infrastructure and historically rapid displacement. We call on Russia to immediately end its unjustified war and spare civilian lives. And we would like to thank the Secretary General for his efforts to push for an end to the aggression. Devastating Russian attacks in cities such as Mariupol have yet again shown the urgent need for full compliance with international humanitarian law and the tragic consequences for civilians when international humanitarian law is so blatantly ignored. We must never accept impunity for violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. Let me repeat, we must never, and the Nordic countries will never, accept impunity for violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. The war in Ukraine is another tragic example of civilian consequences of war in urban and densely populated areas where civilians are at higher risk and where civilian infrastructure, including schools and hospitals, is too often hit or even targeted. We call on all states to engage constructively in the ongoing consultations on a political declaration to address the humanitarian harm arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Armed conflicts also have devastating effects on the natural environment, which further compounds the long-term consequences of conflict for civilians. Now, international humanitarian law provides rules for protecting the environment in armed conflict, and these rules need to be put into action. And the ICRC's updated guidelines and the work done by the International Law Commission should and must guide our endeavors. We are extremely concerned about the rising conflict-driven food insecurity in many parts of the world, such as the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, and Yemen, which are further aggravated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Nordics support international efforts to counter the crisis, including the Secretary General's Global Crisis Response Group, where the Prime Minister of Denmark is one of 6 global champions. More efforts are needed to alleviate hunger in armed conflict and caused by armed conflict, in line with UN Security Council 2417. Mr. President, we are appalled by the number of humanitarian workers who are kidnapped, wounded, or killed at a global scale. Local humanitarians suffer by far the greatest proportion of casualties, and the percentage is going up. We must take concrete measures to protect humanitarian actors working to save lives, including by investing in the safety and security of local staff. Mr. President, it is vital that life-saving assistance and protection reach the people most in need and people in hard-to-reach areas. We once again call on parties to conflict to ensure safe, rapid, and unhindered access for humanitarian actors in accordance with international humanitarian law and to guarantee the respect for humanitarian principles. This is the responsibility of all parties to conflict, and the importance of this cannot be understated, and the responsibility cannot be ignored. We must work actively and on multiple fronts to ensure safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access. 3 points. First, we must counter deeply worrying trends of misinformation and disinformation, eroding the trust in the humanitarian mandate, putting humanitarians at risk, and denying civilians the protection they need and require. To improve and maintain access, we must all do our part to ensure that the neutral, impartial, and independent nature of humanitarian access is understood and respected. Second, the report of the high-level panel on international displacement and the Secretary-General's action agenda have created new momentum to create better solutions for internally displaced persons. We must build on this, and a core priority should be reaching internally displaced who are often in particularly vulnerable positions. And we emphasize the need to align and mainstream the protection of IDPs as an integrated part of protection of civilians, including in UN peacekeeping missions. And third, we must be better at reaching persons belonging to the most marginalized groups, such as children, women, and girls, and do so by focusing on their special protection needs, as well as addressing the gendered impacts of war. We must prioritize preventing and responding to sexual and gender-based violence, providing life-saving sexual and reproductive health services, and further integrate mental health and psychosocial support into preparedness, response, and recovery through meaningful and equal partnerships, including with women-led organizations. Ultimately, Mr. President, ending civilian suffering during conflict is a question of political will, and parties to conflict must actively pursue peace and protect civilians, and we must hold them accountable when they fail to honor this responsibility. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Belgium.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the United States for organizing this important debate, as well as the briefers for their compelling presentations. My country aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union, as well as with the statements of the Group of Friends of the Protection of Civilians and the Group of Friends on the Responsibility to Protect. Mr. President, early this year, in a debate here in this Council, my delegation expressed its grave concern that respect for international humanitarian law had dropped to an all-time low and humanitarian needs had increased to an all-time high. We deplored that the resurgence of urban warfare in the last decades and its devastating impact on civilian populations, essential infrastructures and services such as schools and hospitals. We condemned the fact that civilians represented close to 90% of the casualties and that the impediments to humanitarian access persist in far too many conflicts. We also expressed regret that the COVID-19 pandemic further aggravated an already critical situation. If that were not enough, during the last 3 months, Russia's illegal and brutal aggression against Ukraine has further exacerbated all of these trends. Today, the question facing us with a renewed sense of urgency is an obvious one. When will we successfully put an end to widespread civilian harm in conflicts? The answer to that question is obvious. When parties to conflict make it a political priority to strictly comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and respect at all times its rules and principles, in particular the prohibition of direct attacks on civilians and civilian objects. Mr. President, you urged us to focus today's debate on practical ideas for ensuring better humanitarian access and breaking the trend of denial of access in conflict settings. My country would like to stress 3 points in this regard. First, Belgium calls on parties to armed conflicts to facilitate rapid and unimpeded access to humanitarian relief and to ensure the safety of humanitarian personnel. My country further urges all parties to remove barriers to humanitarian operations, starting with administrative barriers. In cases of excessive barriers, humanitarian actors should be granted the means to safely and effectively monitor, document, and report on denial obstructions, and constraints on humanitarian actions. Consistent and long-term engagement with all parties in conflict, including non-state armed groups for humanitarian purposes, should be fostered as a means to gain safe and timely access and to promote respect for international humanitarian law. My delegation welcomes the effort of the Geneva Call in this regard. Humanitarian organizations and donors should also continue to support innovative initiatives such as cash assistance and localization of efforts to ensure assistance reaches the most vulnerable, as well as the use of new technologies for needs assessment. Second, we call on the full implementation of the commitments contained in UN Security Council Resolution 2573 to protect access to essential services. Parties to armed conflicts should integrate concrete measures to safeguard the humanitarian space and protect healthcare and essential civilian facilities, including in counterterrorism and sanction contexts. In the planning of military operation, greater attention should be given to the possible effects of hostilities towards civilian infrastructure and services. My country further calls on donors to provide flexible multi-year funding to humanitarian organizations to ensure longer-term systemic support to civilian population and to strengthen the resilience of essential service systems in order to reduce the risk of development reversals and reinforce short-term emergency response. The development of partnerships with relevant actors, and particularly local communities and essential service providers, is also key. Third, the denial of humanitarian access is one of the 6 grave violations identified and condemned by this Council as affecting children in armed conflicts. Children are the most vulnerable victims of conflicts and humanitarian disasters. Belgium remains committed to addressing the needs of children affected by armed conflicts, facilitating access to essential services such as health and education, and intensifying efforts to prevent and address grave violations against them. In this vein, my delegation calls on all parties to address the plight of children in particular and calls for the implementation of the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the involvement of children in armed conflicts, the Safe School Declaration, and the Paris and Vancouver Principles. To conclude, Belgium promotes a multidimensional approach to protection of civilians based on prevention, protection, monitoring, as well as accountability. The fight against impunity for the most serious crimes, both at national and international level, remains one of Belgium's priorities. We continue to support international justice and accountability mechanisms for violation of international law and urge all UN member states to do the same. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Belgium for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the United States delegation for convening this important annual Security Council debate on protection of civilians in armed conflict, and thank all the briefers for their insightful interventions. Mr. President, the Secretary General's latest report on this item paints a very grim picture. In 2021, the United Nations recorded at least 11,075 civilian deaths across 12 armed conflicts. Yet the number of recorded civilian deaths actually declined in comparison to the previous year. This decline was due in large measure to the cessation of the conflict in Afghanistan after 15 August 2021. After 40 years of fighting, there is an opportunity now to restore peace, stability, and development in Afghanistan. One government controls the entire country, there is no civil war, and no mass civilian casualties. We commend the Secretary General and the UN agencies for the extensive humanitarian operation underway in Afghanistan. This has saved millions of Afghan lives. Adequate external support is essential to restore the banking and financial system, reconstruct infrastructure, and revive the economy, including by the use of the financial assets belonging to Afghanistan. Holding back such support
will not promote the international community's objectives of human rights or counterterrorism. On the contrary, it may result in the opposite. As Pakistan's Minister of State for Foreign Affairs stated the day before in Davos, and I quote, both the international community and the interim Afghan government need to revisit their approaches by prioritizing the interests and aspirations of ordinary Afghans, unquote. Together with neighboring and other countries, Pakistan is working with the interim Afghan government to address all issues, including the threat posed by terrorist groups. It is only through persistent, patient, and prudent engagement that the international community can achieve the shared objectives of a peaceful, stable, and prosperous Afghanistan. Mr. President, the question arises how to protect civilians when the suppression of civilians is the very object of a military's operations. This is the case when foreign occupation forces resort to the forcible denial of the right of peoples to self-determination and seek to perpetuate their illegal occupation. This is vividly illustrated in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, where the objective of the 900,000 Indian troops is to suppress the demand of the Kashmiri people for freedom and their legitimate right to self-determination, promised to them in the resolutions of the Security Council. Since 5 August 2019, Indian troops are stationed in every city, town, village, and neighborhood of occupied Kashmir to impose what India's leaders have themselves ominously called a final solution for Jammu and Kashmir. They have resorted to cordon and search operations, extrajudicial killing of innocent Kashmiris, collective punishments destroying entire Kashmiri neighborhoods and villages, violence against peaceful protesters, including the use of pellet guns that have blinded hundreds of Kashmiri children, and arbitrary detention of 13,000 young Kashmiri boys and the entire Kashmiri political leadership. Like other colonists, India has sought to portray the Kashmiri freedom struggle as terrorism. It is India's suppression of this legitimate struggle which violates international law and constitutes war crimes. The conviction and sentencing today by an Indian kangaroo court of the Kashmiri leader Yasin Malik is the latest illustration of Indian oppression. As my Prime Minister has declared, India can imprison Yasin Malik, but it can never imprison the idea of freedom which he symbolizes. To consolidate its occupation, India is also embarked on transforming occupied Jammu and Kashmir from a Muslim-majority state to a Hindu-majority territory, in blatant violation of Security Council resolutions, the Fourth Geneva Convention, and international law. Indian authorities are issuing millions of fake domicile certificates to non-Kashmiris, seizing and selling off their land, gerrymandering electoral constituencies through a so-called delimitation commission to reduce Muslim representation and install a BJP-RSS puppet government in Srinagar. Mr. President, the danger of another conflict between Pakistan and India will remain ever present until the dispute over Jammu and Kashmir is resolved. The Secretary General's report notes, and I quote, "The prospect of nuclear conflict, once unthinkable, is now back within the realm of possibility," unquote. This observation applies not only to the dangerous conflict now raging in Ukraine, but also to a nuclearized South Asia. Pakistan, therefore, urges the Secretary General and it urges the Security Council not to neglect the Kashmir dispute, to deploy diplomacy and mobilize the political will to promote a just and peaceful resolution of the Jammu and Kashmir dispute in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter, Security Council resolutions, and the wishes of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank the United States Presidency for having convened this important meeting. In his report on the protection of civilians, the Secretary General observed that armed conflicts continue to be characterized by high levels of civilian death, forced displacement, destroyed civilian objects, and the damaged natural environment. Azerbaijan reiterates its strong condemnation of all violations of international humanitarian law. During its aggression against my country since the early 1990s, Armenia committed multiple war crimes, resulting in the death of tens of thousands of civilians, massive ethnic cleansing, the extensive destruction and cultural erasure of populated areas. The scale of the brutalities is evidenced also by almost 4,000 citizens of Azerbaijan who went missing in connection with the conflict, including 719 civilians. Armenia fails to clarify the whereabouts of the missing persons who fell into its hands but have not been seen since. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the horrific massacre committed in the town of Khojaly, where in February 1992, hundreds of Azerbaijani civilians were brutally killed by invading Armenian forces. This tragedy, which independent experts recognized as the largest and worst single atrocity of the war, was condemned internationally as a crime against humanity or an act of genocide. The deliberate tactic of targeting the civilian population was used again by Armenian forces in the course of hostilities in the fall of 2020. Direct and indiscriminate missile attacks that struck Azerbaijani cities and districts, including with the use of internationally banned cluster bombs, killed and wounded hundreds of civilians and destroyed numerous civilian objects. The frequency and timing of the attacks, including in particular a series of ruthless nighttime missile strikes on the residential areas in the cities of Ganja and Barda, testify to the clear intent and purpose to cause the greatest possible civilian casualties. Moreover, since the end of the war, many civilians have been killed or injured by mine explosions, as Armenia fails to share accurate and comprehensive information about the hundreds of thousands of landmines it laid on Azerbaijan's territory. Mr. President, accountability and broader transitional justice are undeniable and must be an inevitable consequence of the offenses committed. They are also essential tools to prevent recurrence of violations and an important constituent on the path to building, strengthening, and sustaining peace and promoting reconciliation and development. In conclusion, in regard to humanitarian activities, the reasons leading to the erosion of trust and jeopardizing relief efforts, as highlighted in the report of the Secretary General, are often rooted also in attempts to advance hostile political narratives, including under the guise of feigned care for people in need and by recourse to extensive disinformation. It is imperative that the engagement of humanitarian actors in both conflict and post-conflict situations be exclusively humanitarian in nature, not misused for political purposes and carried out in conformity with the principles of neutrality, impartiality, and consent of the affected country, while fully respecting the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national unity of states in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. As the Secretary General underlined in his report, the effective protection of civilians requires much greater political will and commitment to respect international law and implement good policies and practices. This definitely must be the key objective. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Azerbaijan for his statement. The representative of India has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give her the floor.
Mr. President, we are constrained to take the floor again at this late hour, and in the interest of time, I will be very brief. As has become a habit these days, the representative of Pakistan has once again, like a broken record, made unwarranted remarks against my country. This continuous misuse of the United Nations to propagate false and malicious propaganda against my country needs to be treated with the contempt it deserves. However, in order not to let them get away with their repeated falsehoods, I will have to present the correct position in front of the world. The Union territories of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh were, are, and will always remain an integral and inalienable part of India. This includes the areas that are under the illegal occupation of Pakistan. No amount of rhetoric and propaganda from any country can deny this fact. The only contribution that Pakistan can make is to stop state-sponsored terrorism. We saw the spirited defense today by the representative of Pakistan in support of a person who has himself pleaded guilty on charges of terror financing. One really cannot go lower than this. As regards to his other remarks, Mr. President, we will not dignify those with a response. I thank you.
I thank the representative of India for her statement. The representative of Pakistan has asked the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation is exercising its right of reply in response to the statement just made by India. Let us examine the points she made, beginning with the reference to Jammu and Kashmir. Jammu and Kashmir is not an integral part of India. It is a disputed territory, as evidenced by all the UN maps and UN official documents. Security Council Resolution 47 notes the desire of India and Pakistan that, and I quote, "The question of the accession of Jammu and Kashmir to India or Pakistan should be decided through the democratic method of a free and impartial plebiscite." This call for a plebiscite was reiterated in Security Council Resolution 91 of 1951 and Resolution 122 of 1957, among others in resolutions of the UN Commission on India and Pakistan, specifically its resolution of 13 August 1948 and 5 January 1949. India accepted this decision and is bound to comply with it in accordance with Article 25 of the UN Charter. So much for Jammu and Kashmir being an integral part of India. Living in this alternative reality, India continues to deny its illegal occupation of Jammu and Kashmir. Only an occupier would oppose the implementation of Security Council resolutions that promise self-determination to the people of disputed state of Jammu and Kashmir. If India has any respect for international law and moral courage, it would end its reign of terror, withdraw its troops, and let the Kashmiris freely decide their future in accordance with the Security Council resolutions. Mr. President, one can grant that India knows a lot about terrorism. It has the dubious distinction of being one of the world's pioneers and largest purveyors of state terrorism. It has instigated, sponsored, and abetted state terrorism in each of its neighboring countries, including against my own country, Pakistan. At home, the Hindutva Raj is unleashing the worst form of state-directed terrorism against all minorities. Under the current RSS-BJP government, India is being guided by a supremacist ideology that has masterminded Islamophobia in the political discourse. One cannot expect anything new from the purveyors of Hindutva. In today's incredibly intolerant India, 200 million Muslim minority faces frequent lynching by cow vigilantes, pogroms by RSS thugs, with official complicity, discriminatory citizenship laws to expel Muslims, and a concerted campaign to destroy mosques and the rich Muslim heritage of India. With such horrendous track record in democracy, rule of law, and human rights, India surely does not deserve a place at this very council and in the wider law-abiding world community. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. Before adjourning today's meeting, I'd like to again, on behalf of this council, thank our colleagues from the UN, from SCAD, from Conference Services, from Security, and for our interpreters today, who've worked extra hours today and throughout this week to ensure that this important debate was able to occur successfully today. Thank you to each of you. This meeting is adjourned.